Welcome, weary wanderer, to a tale that spans decades and dimensions, where genius and madness walk hand in hand through corridors lined with mechanical marvels and unthinkable horrors. Tonight, we explore the complete saga of the Afton family, a story of innovation corrupted by obsession, of love twisted into something darker than hate, of children caught in the web of their father's impossible ambitions. This is the chronicle of William Afton and those bound to him by blood and tragedy, a legacy written in circuits and souls, in spring locks and sorrow. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the rise and fall of a family whose name would become synonymous with terror itself. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us begin this journey into the heart of darkness that beats within every Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. In the beginning, there was simply a man with a dream, and the skills to make that dream a reality. William Afton emerged from obscurity sometime in the 1970s, though the exact details of his origins remain shrouded in the kind of mystery that would later characterize so much of his life and work. What we know with certainty is that he possessed a brilliant mind for engineering and robotics, combined with an entrepreneurial spirit that burned as brightly as his ambition. The young William Afton was, by all accounts, a man of considerable charm and intelligence. Those who knew him in those early days described someone whose enthusiasm for his work was infectious, whose vision for the future of entertainment technology seemed boundless. He possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and business acumen that would prove essential for what he was about to undertake. His understanding of mechanical systems was intuitive and profound, while his grasp of what audiences wanted from their entertainment experiences showed a psychological insight that bordered on the uncanny. It was during this period of creative ferment that William encountered the person who would become both his greatest collaborator and, in time, his most tragic victim. Henry Emily shared William's passion for bringing joy to children through innovative technology, but where William's approach was marked by ambition and a desire to push boundaries, Henry brought a gentler sensibility, rooted in genuine love for the craft itself and the happiness it could create. The partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily began as one of those perfect professional marriages that seemed destined by fate itself. Their complementary skills and shared vision created a synergy that neither could have achieved alone. William's technical innovations provided the mechanical foundation for their creations, while Henry's artistic sensibilities and deep understanding of storytelling gave those creations the warmth and personality that would make them beloved by generations of children. Their first major collaboration was the establishment of Fredbear's Family Diner, a restaurant concept that would revolutionize the family entertainment industry in ways that neither man could have fully anticipated. The diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a complete entertainment experience built around the revolutionary animatronic characters that William and Henry had created together. These weren't the crude mechanical figures that had characterized earlier attempts at automated entertainment, but sophisticated creations that seemed to blur the line between machine and living being. The centerpiece of their operation was Fredbear himself, a golden bear animatronic whose design represented the pinnacle of their collaborative genius. Fredbear was massive, standing nearly 7 feet tall, and possessing a presence that commanded attention from the moment anyone entered the diner. His golden fur caught the light in ways that made him seem almost magical to the children who gathered around the stage where he performed, while his mechanical precision allowed for performances of remarkable complexity and emotional depth. But Fredbear was more than just an impressive piece of machinery. He was the embodiment of a revolutionary technology that William had developed, something he called Springlock Technology. This innovation allowed a single unit to function both as an autonomous animatronic and as a wearable suit that human performers could inhabit. The spring-lock mechanisms were marvels of mechanical engineering, designed to hold the animatronic components in place during automated performances, while allowing for rapid reconfiguration when a human operator needed to enter the suit. The spring-lock system represented William's genius for practical innovation. During the day, Fredbear could perform his programmed routines with all the precision and reliability that audiences had come to expect from advanced animatronics. But when special occasions arose, when the need for more nuanced interaction with guests presented itself, a trained performer could enter the suit and bring an even more personalized experience to the children who visited the diner. The technical challenges involved in creating such a system were staggering. The spring locks had to be powerful enough to hold heavy animatronic components securely in place during mechanical operation, yet sensitive enough to respond instantly when a human operator needed them to retract. The mechanisms required precise calibration and constant maintenance, as even the smallest malfunction could have serious consequences for anyone wearing the suit. William approached these challenges with the methodical precision that characterized all his work, but also with an enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely enjoyed pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible. He spent countless hours refining the spring lock mechanisms, testing different configurations and materials until he achieved what he considered the perfect balance of functionality and safety. The fact that these systems would later become instruments of horror was an irony that would haunt him, though whether with regret or satisfaction remained a question that only he could answer. The success of Fredbear's family diner exceeded even William's ambitious expectations. Families flocked to the restaurant not just for the food, but for the unique entertainment experience that the animatronics provided. Children who might normally be restless during a family dinner were captivated by the performances on stage, while parents appreciated the high quality of both the food and the entertainment that kept their children engaged and happy. The animatronics became local celebrities in their own right, with children requesting specific songs or developing favorites among the characters. This level of engagement went beyond mere novelty. It suggested that William and Henry had tapped into something fundamental about how children related to mechanical beings that possessed personality and apparent consciousness. The boundary between real and artificial became meaningless to young minds that were perfectly willing to accept these mechanical performers as friends and companions. William found himself fascinated by this relationship between children and his creations. He would spend hours observing the interactions, noting how the young visitors responded to different types of performances, how they seemed to form genuine emotional connections with beings that were, at their core, nothing more than sophisticated machines. This fascination was initially innocent enough, the natural curiosity of an inventor studying how his creations functioned in their intended environment. Yet there was something deeper in William's observations, a quality of attention that suggested interests beyond mere professional development. He seemed particularly drawn to moments of strong emotional response from the children, whether joy or fear or excitement. He began keeping detailed notes on these interactions, documenting not just the technical performance of his animatronics, but the psychological impact they had on their young audiences. The success of the original diner led inevitably to expansion. William and Henry began developing additional characters to populate their mechanical menagerie, each one designed to fill a specific role in the entertainment experience they were crafting. Spring Bonnie joined Fredbear on stage, a yellow rabbit whose design incorporated the same Springlock technology that made the bear such a versatile performer. Spring Bonnie represented a evolution in their design philosophy, incorporating lessons learned from Fredbear's operation while introducing new features that expanded the possibilities for interaction and performance. Where Fredbear embodied strength and reliability, Spring Bonnie was designed for agility and expressiveness, capable of more dynamic movements and more nuanced emotional displays. William took particular pride in Spring Bonnie's construction, as the rabbit incorporated several innovations that he had developed independently of Henry's input. The character's facial mechanisms were more sophisticated than anything they had attempted before, capable of producing expressions that seemed genuinely emotional rather than merely mechanical. The Springlock system had been refined based on months of experience with Fredbear, resulting in smoother transitions between automated and manual operation. As the business grew and evolved, so did the relationship between its two founders. William's role gradually shifted toward the technical and business aspects of their operation, while Henry focused increasingly on the creative and artistic elements that gave their characters their distinctive personalities. This division of labor played to their respective strengths, but it also began to create subtle distances between them as their daily work brought them into contact with different aspects of their shared enterprise. William found himself spending more and more time on expansion plans, financial projections, and technical innovations that could give them advantages over potential competitors. The restaurant business was becoming increasingly competitive, and he understood that continued success would require constant innovation and aggressive business practices. His natural instincts leaned toward expansion and market dominance, toward building an entertainment empire that could span the entire country. Henry, meanwhile, remained focused on the heart of what they were trying to accomplish, creating genuine joy and wonder for the children who visited their establishments. He spent his time refining character personalities, developing new performance routines, and ensuring that every aspect of the guest experience lived up to the standards they had established with the original diner. These different focuses were not initially a source of conflict, but they did begin to shape William's thinking in ways that would have profound consequences for everything that followed. The more time he spent thinking about business expansion and competitive advantages, the more he began to see their animatronic technology not just as a means of entertainment, but as a powerful tool that could be applied to various purposes. William's fascination with the psychological impact of his creations continued to deepen as their business expanded. He began to see patterns in how children responded to different types of mechanical beings, how their emotional reactions could be predicted and, to some extent, controlled through careful manipulation of the animatronic's behavior and appearance. This knowledge initially served purely commercial purposes, helping him design characters and experiences that would maximize customer satisfaction and return visits. Yet the same analytical mind that made William such a successful inventor and businessman also led him into areas of inquiry that had nothing to do with legitimate entertainment purposes. He began experimenting with modifications to the animatronic's programming, testing how small changes in behavior or appearance could produce different emotional responses from their young audiences. These experiments were conducted quietly, often during off hours when no other staff members were present to observe his work. The Springlock Technology, that had been such a cornerstone of their early success, also continued to evolve under William's relentless refinement. Each iteration of the system incorporated lessons learned from previous versions, gradually becoming more sophisticated and, paradoxically, more dangerous. The mechanisms required ever more precise calibration, while the consequences of malfunction became correspondingly more severe. William seemed to view the inherent dangers of the Springlock system not as flaws to be eliminated, but as challenges to be mastered. He took pride in his ability to operate the suits safely, to enter and exit them without triggering the mechanisms that could prove fatal to a careless or untrained user. This confidence in his own abilities would later prove tragically misplaced. But during these early years, it simply reinforced his sense of himself as someone who could master any technical challenge through sufficient application of intelligence and determination. The relationship between William and Henry during this period remained cordial and professionally productive, but subtle changes were beginning to emerge that would eventually drive a wedge between them. William's increasing focus on expansion and technical innovation sometimes put him at odds with Henry's preference for perfecting their existing operations rather than constantly adding new elements. More significantly, Henry began to notice changes in William's personality that troubled him without being dramatic enough to address directly. William's enthusiasm for his work remained as strong as ever, but it was beginning to take on a quality that Henry found difficult to define. There was an intensity to William's interest in their creations that went beyond normal professional dedication, a fascination with certain aspects of their operation that seemed almost obsessive. These concerns remained largely unspoken during the early years of their partnership, dismissed as the natural quirks of a brilliant and driven individual. Henry valued their professional relationship too highly to risk damaging it over what might have been nothing more than his own imagination. Yet seeds of doubt had been planted that would eventually grow into the suspicions and fears that would tear their partnership apart. The success of Fredbear's Family Diner established William Afton as a significant figure in the emerging family entertainment industry. His innovations in animatronic technology and his business acumen had created something entirely new, a template that would be copied and adapted throughout the industry for decades to come. He had achieved the kind of success that most entrepreneurs can only dream of, building a thriving business around technology that he had developed largely through his own efforts. Yet success brought with it new challenges and new temptations. The more William achieved, the more ambitious his goals became. He began to see their current operation not as a destination, but as a stepping stone towards something much larger and more significant. His vision expanded beyond simple entertainment toward concepts that pushed the boundaries of what animatronic technology could accomplish and how it could be used to influence and control human behavior. The man who had begun as simply an inventor with a dream was slowly transforming into something else entirely. The seeds of obsession had been planted, and they were beginning to grow in the fertile soil of success and unchecked ambition. William Afton was becoming someone who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, regardless of the cost to himself or to those around him. This transformation was gradual and subtle, hidden beneath the continued success of their business and the ongoing development of new and impressive animatronic creations. To outside observers, William remained the brilliant and charismatic entrepreneur who had revolutionized family entertainment. Even Henry, who worked closely with him on a daily basis, saw only hints of the darkness that was growing within his partner's mind and heart. But the transformation was real and irreversible. The William Afton who had dreamed of bringing joy to children through innovative technology was slowly giving way to someone whose interests lay in very different directions. The stage was being set for tragedies that would echo across decades, for horrors that would transform the Afton name from a symbol of innovation and success into something that parents would use to frighten their children into obedience. The beginning was ending, though no one yet understood what that meant or what would rise to take its place. Behind every great man, it is said, stands a great woman. And in the case of William Afton, this truism held with a poignancy that would only become apparent after she was gone. Mrs. Afton for history has been cruel enough to erase even her first name from most records, was the beating heart of a family that would eventually become synonymous with horror and tragedy. Yet in the beginning, in those golden years before darkness claimed her husband's soul, she was the anchor that kept the Afton household grounded in love, normalcy, and the simple pleasures of domestic happiness. She had met William during his early days as an inventor, when his dreams were still untainted by the obsessions that would later consume him. The attraction between them was immediate and profound, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that transcended the mere physical chemistry that draws young people together. William, for all his brilliance and ambition, found in her something he had never expected to need, a sense of completeness that made all his professional achievements seem secondary to the simple joy of coming home to her welcoming embrace. Mrs. Afton possessed a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being, touching everyone who came into her presence with the kind of gentle kindness that makes the world feel like a safer, more hopeful place. She had a way of listening that made people feel heard, of speaking that conveyed both wisdom and compassion, of moving through daily life with a grace that transformed even the most mundane household tasks into expressions of love for her family. Her beauty was the kind that deepened with time and intimacy, less about perfect features than about the light that seemed to shine from within her. William would often catch himself watching her as she went about her daily routines, amazed that someone so wonderful had chosen to share her life with him. In her presence, his sometimes harsh edges softened, his driving ambition tempered by the contentment he found in their domestic partnership. The early years of their marriage were marked by the kind of happiness that seems almost too perfect to be real, as if they were living in one of those romantic stories where love conquers all obstacles and every day brings fresh reasons for gratitude. William's business was thriving, their financial future seemed secure, and most importantly, they had discovered in each other the kind of partnership that made every challenge seem manageable and every joy twice as sweet when shared. When their first child was born, Michael, Mrs. Afton approached motherhood with the same gentle competence she brought to everything else in her life. She had an intuitive understanding of what her baby needed, when to soothe and when to encourage independence, how to create an environment of safety and love that would give their son the confidence to explore the world around him. William watched her with their newborn and felt his heart expand in ways he had never thought possible. His love for her deepened by witnessing her transformation into the mother of his children. The birth of Elizabeth 2 years later brought new dimensions to Mrs. Afton's role as the family's emotional center. Where Michael had been a relatively calm baby, Elizabeth arrived in the world with a personality as vibrant and demanding as her father's, requiring different approaches and different kinds of attention. Mrs. Afton adapted seamlessly, somehow finding within herself the energy and wisdom to meet each child's individual needs, while maintaining the peaceful atmosphere that made their home a refuge from the outside world's pressures and complications. It was during this period, when both children were small and demanded constant attention, that Mrs. Afton first began to notice subtle changes in her husband that troubled her without being dramatic enough to address directly. William's work had always been important to him, but his dedication to Fredbear's Family Diner and his ongoing innovations in animatronic technology seemed to be intensifying in ways that sometimes left little room for family life. She would find him in his workshop at all hours of the night, surrounded by mechanical components and technical drawings, so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice her approaching until she spoke his name. When she asked about these late-night sessions, he would explain them in terms of necessary improvements to the restaurant's operations or exciting new possibilities for their animatronic characters. His explanations were always logical and reasonable, yet something in his manner during these conversations made her uneasy in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The workshop itself began to change during this period, evolving from a simple space for tinkering and repairs into something more elaborate and secretive. William installed new security measures, claiming they were necessary to protect proprietary technology from industrial espionage. He began keeping the workshop locked even when he was at home, explaining that some of his experiments involved delicate calibrations that could be ruined by even minor disturbances. Mrs. Afton respected her husband's need for professional privacy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship. The man who had once shared every thought and dream with her was developing aspects of his life that remained hidden from her view. When she tried to discuss these concerns, William would reassure her with the same charm and intelligence that had first won her heart. But his reassurances felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The arrival of their third child, whom they would call Evan, though he would be remembered by history primarily as the crying child, brought both joy and new sources of stress to the Afton household. The baby was more sensitive than his siblings had been, easily frightened by loud noises or sudden movements, requiring a level of constant gentle attention that challenged even Mrs. Afton's considerable reserves of patience and energy. William's reaction to their youngest son was complex and somewhat troubling. He seemed less naturally connected to Evan than he had been to Michael and Elizabeth, as if the child's fearful nature and need for constant reassurance somehow disappointed him. Mrs. Afton found herself becoming protective of her youngest in ways that created subtle tensions within the family dynamic, her maternal instincts putting her at odds with William's apparent expectation that all children should be as bold and curious as Elizabeth or as naturally resilient as Michael. It was around this time that Mrs. Afton began to notice changes in the animatronics that William brought home for testing and refinement. The mechanical beings had always been impressive examples of engineering and artistry, but they were becoming more sophisticated in ways that sometimes struck her as unsettling rather than merely innovative. Their movements were more lifelike, their responses to human presence more complex, their overall presence more aware. Somehow, as if they possessed some form of consciousness that went beyond their programming. When she mentioned these observations to William, he would become animated with enthusiasm, explaining the technical innovations that had made such improvements possible. His pride in these achievements was genuine and infectious. Yet Mrs. Afton couldn't shake the feeling that his relationship with his mechanical creations was becoming more important to him than his relationships with the living members of his family. The success of Fredbear's Family Diner continued to grow throughout this period, bringing with it financial prosperity and social recognition that should have made the Afton family the envy of their community. William was regarded as a visionary entrepreneur whose innovations had revolutionized family entertainment, while Mrs. Afton was admired as the gracious wife who supported her husband's ambitions while raising 3 beautiful children. Yet, beneath this veneer of success and happiness, Mrs. Afton was increasingly aware that something essential was being lost. The intimate partnership that had once defined her marriage was being eroded by William's growing obsession with his work and his gradual withdrawal from the emotional life of their family. He was physically present for meals and family activities, but his mind seemed always to be elsewhere, calculating and planning and envisioning possibilities that had nothing to do with the people who loved him. The children, each in their own way, began to reflect the tensions that were building within their household. Michael, now old enough to understand that something was changing, started acting out in ways that seemed designed to reclaim his father's attention. Elizabeth, with her naturally sunny disposition, tried to bridge the growing gap between her parents by being extra charming and affectionate with both of them. Evan, the most sensitive of the 3, seemed to absorb the household's emotional undercurrents like a sponge, becoming increasingly anxious and clingy as he sensed that the secure world his mother had created around him was somehow under threat. Mrs. Afton found herself carrying an ever-increasing share of the family's emotional labor, serving as counselor and comforter to children who needed more reassurance than they should have required, while also trying to maintain some connection with a husband who seemed to be drifting away from them despite his physical presence in their home. The role was exhausting in ways that went beyond mere physical fatigue, draining her spiritual and emotional reserves as she struggled to hold together a family that was slowly coming apart at the seams. The conversations between husband and wife during this period took on a quality of careful politeness that would have seemed impossible during their early years of marriage, where once they had shared every thought and feeling without reservation, now their interactions were marked by unspoken boundaries and topics that seemed off-limits by mutual but unacknowledged agreement. William's work became something they discussed only in the most general terms, while Mrs. Afton's concerns about their family life were expressed indirectly through comments about the children's behavior or suggestions about family activities that might bring them closer together. Yet there were still moments when the old William would resurface, when his attention would focus completely on his family and he would remember what it felt like to be a husband and father rather than merely an ambitious inventor and businessman. These interludes gave Mrs. Afton hope that whatever was happening to her husband might be temporary, that the man she had fallen in love with was still there beneath the obsessions and distractions that seemed to be consuming more and more of his time and energy. During one such moment, when William was playing with the children in the backyard while she prepared dinner, Mrs. Afton allowed herself to believe that their family might still find its way back to the happiness they had once known. The sight of her husband laughing with Michael and Elizabeth while gently encouraging Evan to overcome his fears reminded her powerfully of why she had chosen to build a life with this man, and why that choice had once seemed so obviously right. But these moments became increasingly rare as William's work demands continued to intensify and his emotional availability to his family continued to diminish. Mrs. Afton began to feel like she was married to a ghost, someone who inhabited the same house and went through the motions of family life, but whose heart and mind were always elsewhere, focused on projects and possibilities that remained mysterious to her despite her attempts to understand and support his ambitions. The isolation that resulted from this growing emotional distance was particularly difficult for someone whose nature was as fundamentally social and connected as Mrs. Afton's. She had always derived her greatest satisfaction from relationships, from the give and take of genuine human connection, from the simple pleasure of being known and loved by the people who mattered most to her. To find herself increasingly cut off from meaningful communication with her husband was like losing a fundamental part of herself. Friends and neighbors who had once envied the Afton family's apparent perfection began to notice subtle changes in Mrs. Afton's demeanor during this period. She remained as kind and gracious as ever, but there was a quality of sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense that she was carrying burdens that she couldn't share with anyone. When asked about William's work or their family life, she would respond with the same warm smile and positive comments that had always characterized her public persona, but those who knew her well could sense the effort required to maintain this facade. The mystery of Mrs. Afton's ultimate fate remains one of the most haunting aspects of the family's tragic story. What is certain is that at some point during this period of growing strain and isolation, she disappeared from her family's life in a way that left no clear explanation and no possibility of return. Whether her absence resulted from accident, illness, or something more sinister, the records that might have provided answers have been lost to time or deliberately destroyed. Some accounts suggest that she simply left, unable to endure any longer the emotional neglect and growing strangeness of her husband's behavior. Others hint at a more tragic end, perhaps the result of one of William's experiments gone wrong, or his growing instability manifesting in violence toward the person who knew him best and might have tried to stop him from pursuing his darkest impulses. The most haunting possibility is that Mrs. Afton became one of her husband's earliest victims, that her disappearance marked the beginning of his transformation from neglectful spouse to actual killer. The timing would be consistent with what is known about William's psychological development, and her intimate knowledge of his activities and personality changes would have made her a threat to whatever plans he was developing in the secrecy of his workshop. What is certain is that her absence created a void in the Afton household that could never be filled. The woman who had served as the family's emotional anchor, the source of warmth and stability that had made their house a home, was gone. The children were left to navigate their formative years without the maternal guidance that had been such a crucial part of their early development, while William was freed from the one person who might have been able to pull him back from the brink of the abyss he was approaching. Michael, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened but too young to process the full implications of his mother's absence, began the descent into the cruelty and emotional distance that would characterize his teenage years. Elizabeth, with her naturally optimistic nature, tried to fill the role her mother had vacated, becoming the family's primary source of emotional support at an age when she should have been receiving such support rather than providing it. Evan, the most vulnerable of the three children, was perhaps most damaged by the loss of his mother's protective presence. Already fearful and anxious by nature, he found himself in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous and unpredictable, with no one capable of providing the constant reassurance he needed to function normally. William's reaction to his wife's absence was complex and revealing. On the surface, he seemed to adapt to single parenthood with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that the household continued to function and that the children's basic needs were met. Yet there was a coldness to his approach that suggested her disappearance had removed not just a person he loved, but also the last remaining barrier to whatever dark impulses were growing within him. In the years that followed Mrs. Afton's disappearance, William's work took on an increasingly frantic quality, as if he were trying to fill the void her absence had created through ever more ambitious and complex projects. The animatronics he developed during this period were more sophisticated than anything he had created while she was alive, but they were also more unsettling, possessing qualities that seemed to reflect their creator's deteriorating mental state. The house itself began to change in ways that reflected the family's altered dynamics. Rooms that had once been filled with warmth and laughter became quiet and somewhat lifeless, while William's workshop expanded to occupy larger portions of the basement and garage. The children learned to stay out of their father's way when he was working, sensing that his tolerance for interruption had become dangerously limited. Mrs. Afton's memory became a complicated presence within the household, simultaneously cherished and avoided by family members who processed her loss in different ways. Michael sometimes spoke of her with an idealization that suggested guilt about his own inability to protect her, while Elizabeth tried to embody the maternal qualities she remembered in an effort to maintain some semblance of the family structure they had once known. William rarely mentioned his wife after her disappearance, and when he did, it was usually in the context of practical matters related to household management or the children's care. Whether this silence reflected genuine grief, guilty knowledge of what had happened to her, or simply his characteristic emotional distance from matters that didn't serve his professional ambitions, remained unclear to those around him. The community that had once celebrated the Afton family as an example of success and happiness gradually forgot about Mrs. Afton's existence, their memories of her fading as William's reputation as an innovative businessman continued to grow. She became a footnote in a story that would eventually be remembered for very different reasons. Her contributions to her family's brief period of genuine happiness overlooked in favor of the horrors that would follow. Yet for those who had known her, Mrs. Afton remained a powerful reminder of what the family had been before darkness claimed it. She represented the road not taken, the possibility of a different outcome, if love and compassion had been allowed to triumph over ambition and obsession. Her absence was the crack in the foundation that would eventually lead to the complete collapse of everything the Afton name had once represented. In the end, Mrs. Afton's greatest tragedy may have been her timing. She had the misfortune to love a man whose capacity for genuine human connection was gradually being consumed by drives and desires that had nothing to do with the bonds of family and marriage. She gave her heart to someone who would eventually become incapable of returning that love. And she paid the ultimate price for that gift. The void she left behind would never be filled, and the family that had once known happiness under her gentle guidance would never again experience the kind of peace and contentment that had once seemed as natural as breathing. Mrs. Afton was both the family's greatest blessing and its most profound loss. The person whose presence had made them whole and whose absence would ensure their ultimate destruction. Children are born into this world as blank canvases, upon which experience will paint the patterns that define their character and destiny. The 3 Afton children entered life during what should have been their family's golden age, when William's innovations were bringing prosperity and recognition, when their mother's love provided the warmth and stability that every child deserves, when the future seemed bright with unlimited possibility. Yet, even in those early years, before tragedy and horror claimed their household, each child displayed the seeds of the traits that would eventually define their roles in the dark legend their family name would become. Michael Afton arrived in the world as the firstborn son of parents whose love for each other seemed capable of creating miracles. His birth marked the beginning of William's transformation, from ambitious inventor to devoted father, a change that brought out qualities of tenderness and protection that few would have suspected existed beneath the driven exterior. Mrs. Afton approached motherhood with the same gentle competence she brought to everything else, creating an environment of such warmth and security that Michael's earliest years were marked by the kind of contentment that comes from knowing absolutely that one is loved and wanted. As a small child, Michael displayed a natural intelligence that clearly came from his father's side of the family, combined with a social warmth that reflected his mother's influence. He was curious about everything, asking endless questions about how things worked and why the world operated according to the rules he was gradually discovering. His parents delighted in his inquisitive nature, seeing in it evidence of the bright future they were certain awaited their firstborn son. The toddler who would one day be consumed by guilt and driven to desperate acts of redemption was, in those early years, simply a bright and loving child who brought joy to everyone who knew him. His laughter filled the Afton household with a music that made even William's most stressful workdays seem manageable, while his natural affection for both parents created the kind of family bonds that seemed unbreakable. Michael's relationship with his father during this period was particularly close, built on a foundation of mutual fascination that served both of their needs perfectly. William found in his son an eager audience for explanations of his mechanical innovations, while Michael discovered in his father a source of seemingly infinite knowledge about the fascinating world of animatronic technology that was beginning to define their family's identity. The workshop visits that became a regular part of Michael's childhood were initially innocent bonding experiences between father and son. William would show him the basic principles behind the Springlock mechanisms, explain how the animatronic characters were programmed to perform their routines, and share his vision of a future where mechanical beings could provide endless entertainment for families like their own. Michael absorbed these lessons with the enthusiasm of a child whose greatest desire was to follow in his father's footsteps and earn the approval of the man he admired above all others. Yet even during these happy times, there were subtle signs that Michael's personality contained elements that would eventually prove troubling. He displayed a competitive streak, that sometimes manifested as cruelty towards smaller children, a need to establish dominance that suggested insecurities beneath his confident exterior. When playing with neighborhood children, he would often devise games that placed him in positions of authority and control, showing little patience for those who couldn't keep up with his quick mind and demanding standards. The arrival of Elizabeth 2 years later brought significant changes to Michael's world and his role within the family structure. No longer the sole focus of his parents' attention, he was forced to adjust to sharing their love and time with a sibling whose needs seemed as demanding as his own. This transition was particularly difficult for a child whose relationship with his father had been built on the assumption that he was special and unique, deserving of exclusive access to William's knowledge and approval. Elizabeth Afton burst into the world with a personality as vibrant and demanding as a summer thunderstorm. Where Michael had been a relatively calm baby who seemed content to observe the world around him before deciding how to interact with it, Elizabeth announced her presence with a force that commanded immediate attention and would brook no delay in having her needs met. Her parents quickly learned that their daughter possessed a will as strong as her father's, combined with a charm that could melt the hardest heart when she chose to employ it. From her earliest moments, Elizabeth displayed the kind of fearless curiosity that would eventually lead her to tragedy. She approached the world with absolute confidence, secure in the knowledge that she was beloved by everyone around her and protected by parents who would never allow harm to come to their precious daughter. This fearlessness was simultaneously her greatest gift and her most dangerous trait, enabling her to experience life with an intensity that few children ever achieve, while also making her vulnerable to dangers that a more cautious child might have avoided. William's reaction to his daughter was immediate and profound. Where his relationship with Michael had been built on shared interests and intellectual connections, his bond with Elizabeth was purely emotional, rooted in a protective instinct so strong it sometimes alarmed even Mrs. Afton. The sight of his little girl could transform William from the driven businessman into a gentle giant who would spend hours on the floor playing elaborate games that Elizabeth invented on the spot. Elizabeth's fascination with her father's animatronic creations began almost from the moment she was old enough to focus her eyes on the mechanical figures that William occasionally brought home for testing and refinement. Unlike Michael, whose interest in the animatronics was primarily technical, Elizabeth related to them as if they were living beings deserving of love and attention. She would insist on saying goodnight to any animatronic that happened to be in the house, would ask about their feelings and needs, and would become genuinely distressed if she thought one of them looked sad or lonely. This emotional connection to mechanical beings was simultaneously touching and somewhat unsettling to observe. Elizabeth's parents initially found her anthropomorphizing of the animatronics charming, evidence of her compassionate nature and active imagination. Yet there was something almost obsessive in her attachment to these mechanical beings, a quality of devotion that suggested needs and desires that went beyond normal childhood fantasy play. William took particular pleasure in Elizabeth's responses to his creations, seeing in her emotional reactions evidence that his animatronics possessed qualities that transcended mere mechanical function. He began designing special interactions between Elizabeth and various characters, testing how she responded to different behaviors and personalities. These experiments were initially innocent, motivated by genuine curiosity about how children related to mechanical beings, and by William's desire to create the best possible experiences for the young customers who visited his restaurants. Yet as time passed, William's interest in Elizabeth's reactions began to take on a more systematic quality that troubled Mrs. Afton without being dramatic enough to address directly. He would spend hours observing how Elizabeth interacted with different animatronics, taking notes on her responses and making adjustments to their programming based on what he learned. His attention to these details was meticulous and somewhat obsessive, suggesting interest that went beyond normal parental pride in a daughter's imaginative play. The relationship between Michael and Elizabeth during these early years was complex, marked by the typical sibling rivalry that characterizes most families with children close in age, but also shaped by their very different personalities and approaches to the world around them. Michael, with his need for control and approval, sometimes resented the attention that Elizabeth's more dramatic personality commanded from their parents. Elizabeth, secure in her position as the family's beloved princess, seemed largely oblivious to her brother's occasional resentment and continued to treat him with the casual affection of someone who had never doubted her place in his heart. The arrival of their third child, whom they would call Evan but who would be remembered by history, primarily through the nickname that reflected his most visible characteristic, brought new dimensions to the Afton family dynamic. The crying child entered a world that was already beginning to show signs of the stress and dysfunction that would eventually tear the family apart, though these changes were still subtle enough that they seemed like normal variations in family life rather than symptoms of something fundamentally wrong. Evan Afton was different from his siblings from his very first breath. Where Michael had been observant and Elizabeth had been demanding, Evan was simply afraid. He seemed to enter the world already overwhelmed by experiences that his older siblings had taken in stride, crying at sounds that didn't disturb other babies, startling at movements that wouldn't have bothered most infants, requiring a level of constant comfort and reassurance that challenged even Mrs. Afton's considerable reserves of patience and energy. The differences between Evan and his siblings became more pronounced as he grew from infant to toddler. While Michael and Elizabeth had approached each new stage of development with confidence and curiosity, Evan seemed to view every new experience as a potential threat requiring careful evaluation before he would risk engagement. His parents found themselves constantly reassuring him about things that most children would have accepted without question, creating an atmosphere of protective vigilance that gradually began to permeate the entire household. William's reaction to his youngest son was complicated and somewhat troubling. The same protective instincts that made him such a devoted father to Elizabeth seemed less naturally activated by Evan's fearful nature and constant need for reassurance. William appeared to view his son's anxieties as problems to be solved rather than natural characteristics to be accepted and accommodated, leading to interactions that sometimes increased rather than reduced the child's stress levels. The workshop that had been a place of wonder and learning for Michael, and a source of fascinating entertainment for Elizabeth, became a source of terror for Evan. The mechanical sounds, the sudden movements of animatronic figures being tested, the various tools and equipment that filled William's workspace, all of these elements combined to create an environment that seemed designed to trigger every one of the child's numerous fears and anxieties. Mrs. Afton found herself increasingly serving as a buffer between Evan and the aspects of their family life that frightened him. She would hold him during the mechanical tests that William conducted at home, covering his ears when the sounds became too loud and providing a constant stream of gentle reassurance that these were just machines, just toys, nothing that could hurt him as long as she was there to keep him safe. Yet even Mrs. Afton's devoted protection couldn't shield Evan from all the sources of anxiety that their household contained. The very success of William's business meant that their home was frequently filled with reminders of the animatronic world that so terrified their youngest child. Marketing materials, prototype figures, mechanical components, and various other artifacts of William's professional life created an environment where Evan could never entirely escape the presence of the beings that haunted his dreams and dominated his waking fears. The relationship between Evan and his siblings during this period reflected the complex dynamics that were developing within the family as a whole. Michael, now old enough to be aware of his father's growing distance and his mother's increasing stress, began to channel his own anxieties into behavior that targeted his most vulnerable sibling. The cruelty that Michael would later display toward Evan had its roots in these early years, when a confused and somewhat neglected older brother discovered that tormenting his fearful younger sibling provided both a sense of power and a way of expressing frustrations he couldn't articulate or address directly. Elizabeth's relationship with Evan was more straightforward but no less complex in its implications. Her natural compassion made her protective of her frightened little brother, yet her own fascination with the very animatronics that terrified him created an irreconcilable conflict between her desire to help him and her inability to understand why he couldn't share her love for the mechanical beings that brought her such joy. The family dynamics that developed around Evan's fears created patterns of interaction that would have profound consequences for all of them. Missy's. Afton's increasing focus on protecting her most vulnerable child meant less attention available for Michael and Elizabeth, contributing to the emotional neglect that would eventually manifest in their own problematic behaviors. William's apparent impatience with Evan's anxieties created distance between father and son that would never be bridged, while also providing a model of emotional coldness that his other children would eventually internalize. The toys and comfort objects that became such important parts of Evan's daily life during this period reflected both his need for security and the family's attempts to provide that security in ways that wouldn't interfere with William's professional activities. The plushie collection that gradually accumulated in Evan's room represented a compromise between his need for comfort and his parents' recognition that he required more support than they could provide through direct interaction alone. The most significant of these comfort objects was a small golden bear that Evan received for his 4th birthday, a plushie that bore a resemblance to Fredbear but was soft and harmless rather than mechanical and frightening. This toy became Evan's constant companion, the one presence in his world that seemed to offer pure comfort without any associated fears or anxieties. He would carry it everywhere, talk to it as if it were alive, and rely on its presence to help him navigate situations that might otherwise have overwhelmed his fragile emotional resources. What none of the family members realized at the time was that this innocent plushie would eventually play a role in events that went far beyond simple childhood comfort. The toy that seemed to represent safety and love would become connected to mysteries that defied rational explanation, serving as a bridge between the world of the living and realms that existed beyond normal human understanding. The household routines that developed around the children's different needs and personalities created an increasingly complex web of accommodations and compromises that reflected the growing dysfunction within the family structure. Mealtimes required careful planning to ensure that nothing would trigger Evan's anxieties while still maintaining some semblance of normal family interaction. Bedtime routines became elaborate rituals designed to help him feel safe enough to sleep, while also ensuring that Michael and Elizabeth received the attention they needed as growing children. Mrs. Afton bore the primary burden of managing these complex dynamics, serving as translator, mediator, and protector for children whose needs were becoming increasingly difficult to balance with her husband's professional demands and their family's public image as a successful and happy household. The emotional labor required to maintain this facade was enormous, contributing to the stress and isolation that would eventually contribute to her mysterious disappearance from their lives. The community's perception of the Afton children during this period reflected the family's success at maintaining appearances despite the growing problems beneath the surface. Michael was regarded as a bright and promising young man who would clearly follow in his father's innovative footsteps, Elizabeth was admired as a spirited and charming little girl whose personality lit up every room she entered. Even Evan, despite his obvious anxieties, was seen as a sweet child who simply needed a bit more time and patience to outgrow his fears. Yet those who observed the family most closely began to notice subtle signs that all was not well in the Afton household. Teachers reported that Michael was becoming more aggressive with classmates, particularly those who reminded him in some way of his younger brother. Elizabeth's vibrant personality sometimes took on a manic quality that suggested emotional needs that weren't being fully met at home. Evan's fears were becoming more specific and more intense, focused increasingly on the animatronic characters that were such a prominent part of their family life. The birthday parties that became an annual tradition for each child reflected both the family's prosperity and the growing complexity of their internal relationships. Michael's parties were elaborate affairs that showcased his father's latest innovations, with animatronic performances and technical demonstrations that impressed other children while serving William's business interests. Elizabeth's celebrations were exercises in controlled chaos, with activities and entertainments designed to match her energetic personality, while keeping her safely away from the more dangerous aspects of her father's work. Evan's birthdays presented unique challenges that reflected his special needs and the family's increasingly desperate attempts to help him overcome his fears. These celebrations were carefully planned to minimize potential triggers, while still providing him with positive experiences involving the mechanical beings that so terrified him. The irony of trying to help a child overcome his fear of animatronics by exposing him to more animatronics was lost on parents who were running out of ideas for helping their youngest son develop the kind of resilience his siblings seemed to possess naturally. The gradual deterioration of William's relationship with his children during this period reflected his increasing obsession with his work and his growing impatience with aspects of family life that interfered with his professional goals. Where he had once delighted in explaining his innovations to Michael, he now seemed annoyed by interruptions to his increasingly secretive experiments. His special bond with Elizabeth remained strong, but even that relationship began to take on qualities that suggested he was more interested in her reactions to his creations than in her development as an individual child. Most troubling was William's apparent inability to connect with Evan in any meaningful way. The child's fears and needs seemed to activate something approaching contempt in his father, as if Evan's anxieties were a personal failing that reflected poorly on the Afton family's strength and competence. The emotional distance between father and youngest son grew steadily during this period, creating a dynamic that would have tragic consequences when events forced them into closer proximity. The seeds of the tragedy that would eventually destroy the Afton family were already visible during these supposedly happy years for those with eyes to see them. The patterns of behavior, the unmet emotional needs, the growing dysfunction hidden beneath a facade of success and prosperity, all of these elements were combining in ways that made some form of catastrophic breakdown almost inevitable. Yet there were also moments during this period when the family seemed capable of genuine happiness and connection, times when the love between parents and children overcame the various pressures and problems that were gradually pulling them apart. These glimpses of what they might have been serve as poignant reminders that the Afton family's eventual destruction was not preordained, that different choices and different circumstances might have led to very different outcomes for children who deserved better than the fate that awaited them. The innocence that characterized all three children during these early years would eventually be lost in different ways and for different reasons, but it was real and precious while it lasted. Michael's cruelty, Elizabeth's obsession, and Evan's terror were all still in the future, seeds that had been planted but not yet grown to maturity. For a brief time, they were simply children living in a world that seemed full of possibility, loved by parents who wanted the best for them, innocent of the horror that their family name would eventually represent. That innocence, once lost, could never be recovered, but while it existed, it provided a foundation of love and security that would sustain each child through the trials that lay ahead, even when those trials seemed designed to destroy everything good and pure about their original nature. The children they had been would always exist somewhere within the damaged individuals they would become, reminders of the potential that had been sacrificed on the altar of their father's consuming obsessions. There are moments in every family's history that serve as invisible dividing lines, marking the boundary between before and after, between innocence and knowledge, between the world as it was and the world as it would forever remain. For the Afton family, that moment arrived on a day that should have been filled with celebration and joy, when their youngest child turned 6 years old, and the family gathered to mark another milestone in what they hoped would be a long and happy life. The 1983 that had dawned with such promise for the Afton household was already showing signs of the strain that would eventually tear them apart. William's behavior had become increasingly erratic and secretive, his workshop sessions extending deep into the night, while strange sounds emanated from behind doors that were now perpetually locked. Mrs. Afton's mysterious absence had left a void that no amount of hired help or family routines could fill, while the children struggled to adapt to a world that seemed less secure and predictable with each passing day. Yet birthdays retained their power to bring temporary unity to even the most troubled families, and Evan's 6th birthday represented an opportunity for the Aftons to recapture some semblance of the happiness they had once known. William, perhaps recognizing that his relationship with his youngest son had deteriorated beyond what any reasonable person could consider acceptable, decided to host the celebration at Fredbear's family diner, hoping that the familiar environment and beloved characters might help bridge the emotional distance that had grown between them. The decision to hold the party at the restaurant was complicated by Evan's well-documented fears of the animatronic characters that were the establishment's primary attraction. His terror of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie had become so pronounced that even seeing advertisements for the restaurant could trigger panic attacks that left him sobbing and inconsolable for hours. Mrs. Afton had always been the one to navigate these episodes, her gentle presence and infinite patience providing the reassurance that could eventually calm their frightened son. Without her stabilizing influence, William found himself attempting to manage Evan's anxieties through methods that reflected his increasingly distorted understanding of human psychology. Rather than accommodating his son's fears, William seemed to believe that forced exposure to the source of those fears would somehow cure them, as if terror were a weakness that could be eliminated through sufficient application of willpower and determination. The planning for Evan's birthday party became a source of tension within the household that reflected all the dysfunction that had been building beneath the surface of their family life. Michael, now 13 years old and struggling with his own complex relationship with his father's expectations and his mother's absence, saw the upcoming celebration as an opportunity to assert some form of control over a situation that had left him feeling powerless and neglected. The cruelty that Michael had begun to display toward his younger brother during this period was not simply the typical sibling rivalry that characterizes most families, but something darker and more systematic that reflected his own psychological damage and unmet emotional needs. The loss of his mother had affected him profoundly, though he lacked the emotional vocabulary to express his grief and confusion in healthy ways. Instead, he channeled these feelings into behavior that targeted the most vulnerable member of their remaining family unit. Elizabeth, now 4 years old, and possessed of the same vibrant personality that had always made her their father's favorite, approached her brother's upcoming birthday With the uncomplicated enthusiasm that characterized her approach to most aspects of life, she remained largely unaware of the psychological dynamics that were tearing her family apart, seeing only that there would be a party with cake and presents and the animatronic characters that she loved with an intensity that sometimes worried the adults around her. The preparations for the party took on an almost manic quality, as William threw himself into planning with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized his approach to his most complex mechanical projects. He seemed determined to create an event that would somehow resolve all the family's problems through sheer force of celebration, as if the right combination of entertainment and spectacle could erase months of neglect, dysfunction, and growing estrangement between family members. The guest list for Evan's party reflected both his social isolation and his father's business connections. Most of the children who would attend were the sons and daughters of William's professional associates, youngsters who knew Evan primarily through their parents' relationships rather than through genuine friendship. The few classmates who were invited came more out of social obligation than personal affection, as Evan's fearful nature and unusual anxieties had made it difficult for him to form the kinds of bonds that normally characterize childhood relationships. Michael's friends represented a different category entirely: older children, whose presence at a 6-year-old's birthday party created dynamics that should have been recognized as problematic by any responsible adult. These teenagers, led by Michael himself, had spent weeks planning what they considered an elaborate prank that would finally force Evan to overcome his irrational fears of the animatronic characters that dominated their family's professional and personal life. The psychology behind Michael's planned joke was complex and deeply troubling, reflecting not only his own emotional damage but also his unconscious absorption of his father's increasingly distorted worldview. Like William, Michael seemed to believe that Evan's fears were weaknesses that could be eliminated through forced confrontation, rather than natural responses that deserved understanding and accommodation. The fact that this belief would lead him to plan an action that would traumatize his already vulnerable brother suggests how completely the family's emotional ecosystem had been poisoned by William's neglect and obsession. The morning of Evan's 6th birthday arrived with all the apparent promise that such days typically bring, though careful observers might have noticed subtle signs that this would be no ordinary celebration. The child himself seemed more anxious than excited, clinging to his beloved plushy bear with an intensity that suggested he was preparing for an ordeal rather than anticipating a joyful occasion. His requests to postpone the party or celebrate at home instead of at the restaurant were dismissed by his father as further evidence of the fears that needed to be overcome rather than respected. William's behavior during the final preparations revealed the extent to which his personality had been altered by months of secretive experimentation and growing disconnection from normal human emotions. He moved through the morning routines with mechanical precision, ensuring that every detail of the party arrangements was perfect while displaying little awareness of his son's obvious distress. The man who had once been capable of such tenderness with his children had been replaced by someone who seemed to view them primarily as subjects for his theories about fear, control, and the malleability of human psychology. The family's arrival at Fredbear's family diner created a scene that would have appeared perfectly normal to casual observers, but was fraught with psychological tensions that made every interaction charged with potential for disaster. Evan's terror was immediately apparent to anyone who cared to notice, his small body trembling as he was carried past the animatronic displays that had been set up to welcome the birthday guests. His desperate attempts to hide behind his father or flee back to the car were interpreted by William not as legitimate distress, but as theatrical displays designed to manipulate adult sympathy. The restaurant itself had been transformed for the occasion into something that represented the pinnacle of William's vision for family entertainment, with additional animatronic figures placed throughout the dining area and special performances scheduled to occur throughout the afternoon. The technological sophistication of these mechanical beings was truly impressive, their movements so lifelike and their programming so complex that they seemed to possess genuine personalities rather than merely following predetermined routines. Yet it was precisely this uncanny realism that made the animatronics so terrifying to a child whose psychological makeup made him hypersensitive to anything that blurred the boundary between the living and the artificial. Where other children saw wonder and excitement, Evan perceived threat and menace, his young mind unable to process beings that seemed simultaneously alive and dead, friendly and predatory, safe and dangerous. The party guests began arriving in groups that reflected the various social circles that intersected around the Afton family's personal and professional life. The younger children, those closer to Evan's own age, were initially delighted by the elaborate entertainment that had been arranged for their enjoyment. The animatronic performances, the games and activities, the carefully choreographed interactions between mechanical characters and human guests, all of these elements combined to create an experience that exceeded anything most of them had previously encountered. The older children, Michael's friends who had come with their own agenda, surveyed the scene with the calculating eyes of predators sizing up their prey. They had spent weeks planning what they considered the perfect prank, one that would simultaneously entertain them and supposedly help Evan overcome his irrational fears. The fact that their plan involved deliberately terrorizing an already traumatized child seemed to have occurred to none of them, their adolescent minds incapable of recognizing the difference between harmless mischief and psychological abuse. As the afternoon progressed and the party moved through its carefully scripted phases, the tension in the room began to build toward what would become an inevitable climax. Evan's distress was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone present, his attempts to hide from the animatronic characters growing more desperate as the mechanical beings seemed to follow him wherever he tried to find refuge. His pleas to go home were dismissed by his father as attention-seeking behavior, while his obvious terror was interpreted by the older children as cowardice that deserved to be punished rather than pitied. The psychological dynamics at work during those crucial hours reflected everything that had gone wrong with the Afton family's internal relationships during the months following Mrs. Afton's disappearance. William's inability to recognize or respond appropriately to his son's genuine distress revealed how completely his paternal instincts had been overridden by his obsession with control and his distorted theories about the genuine Byredden. Benefits of forced exposure to fear. Michael's willingness to torment his already suffering brother demonstrated how thoroughly his own emotional development had been warped by neglect and the toxic example set by their father's increasingly cold and manipulative behavior. Even Elizabeth, despite her young age and naturally compassionate temperament, had absorbed enough of the family's dysfunctional patterns to remain largely oblivious to her brother's suffering. Her delight in the animatronic performances and her excitement about the party activities prevented her from recognizing that what brought her joy was causing Evan profound psychological anguish. The moment when everything changed began, as many tragedies do, with what seemed like harmless fun that gradually escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Michael and his friends, emboldened by the apparent success of their plan to corner Evan near the main stage where Fredbear was performing, decided to take their prank to its logical conclusion by forcing the terrified child into direct contact with the source of his greatest fears. The idea of lifting Evan up to Fredbear's mouth was presented as a joke, a way of helping him give the animatronic bear a birthday kiss that would prove the mechanical character was harmless and friendly. The older boys convinced themselves that they were performing an act of kindness, helping their victim overcome irrational fears through direct confrontation with their source. The psychological cruelty involved in forcing a terrified child into intimate contact with the object of his phobias was either lost on them entirely or dismissed as necessary medicine for his supposed weakness. Evan's screams and struggles as he was lifted toward Fredbear's massive head should have been enough to stop any reasonable person from continuing with such a plan, but the group dynamics that had developed among Michael's friends created a situation where backing down would have been seen as weakness. The social pressure to complete their prank, combined with their adolescent inability to recognize genuine distress, created a momentum that carried them past the point where rational thought might have intervened. The mechanics of what happened next would be debated for years afterward, with various theories proposed to explain how a situation that was supposed to be harmless could have resulted in such catastrophic consequences. The springlock mechanisms that were such a crucial component of Fredbear's design were incredibly sophisticated pieces of engineering, but they were also inherently dangerous systems that required precise maintenance and careful operation to function safely. The official explanation would eventually focus on mechanical failure, suggesting that the spring locks that held Fredbear's jaw mechanism in place had somehow malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. The tremendous pressure required to keep the animatronic's mouth properly aligned during performances meant that any failure of the locking system would result in the rapid and violent closure of jaws that possessed enough force to crush anything caught between them. Yet, there were aspects of what occurred that suggested the malfunction might not have been entirely accidental. William's increasingly unstable mental state, combined with his obsessive interest in the psychological effects of fear and trauma, raised questions about whether he might have deliberately sabotaged the spring lock mechanisms as part of some twisted experiment in terror and control. The fact that he had been working on modifications to Fredbear's internal systems in the weeks leading up to the party provided opportunities for such sabotage that a more thorough investigation might have uncovered. The sound that filled Fredbear's family diner when the spring locks failed was unlike anything the witnesses would ever be able to forget. A combination of mechanical snap and organic crunch that seemed to come from the very depths of nightmare itself. The silence that followed was even more terrible, broken only by the continued playing of the birthday song that the restaurant's sound system had been programmed to repeat throughout the celebration. Evan's small body went limp in a way that made clear to everyone present that something irreversible had occurred, though the full extent of the damage would not become apparent until the paramedics arrived and began their desperate attempts to preserve whatever life remained in the broken child. The injuries he had sustained were so severe that survival seemed impossible, yet somehow his heart continued beating and his lungs continued drawing breath, as if some part of him refused to surrender to the inevitable. Michael's reaction to what he had done was immediate and profound. The cruel teenager suddenly transformed into a horrified child who understood that his harmless prank had resulted in consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. The psychological impact of witnessing his brother's destruction, of knowing that his own actions had been the direct cause of such trauma, would haunt him for the rest of his life and drive him to acts of desperation and attempted redemption that would define his entire future existence. William's response to the crisis revealed the extent to which his personality had been altered by months of obsession and psychological deterioration. Where a normal father would have been consumed by grief and guilt, William seemed primarily concerned with damage control and the protection of his business interests. His immediate focus on managing the legal and financial consequences of the incident, rather than on his dying son's medical needs, demonstrated how completely his priorities had been distorted by his descent into madness. The hospital vigil that followed became a surreal nightmare of medical procedures and desperate hope, as the Afton family maintained a bedside watch over a child whose injuries should have been immediately fatal, but who somehow clung to life with a tenacity that defied medical explanation. Evan's condition was so precarious that the doctors could offer no meaningful prognosis, only the observation that each moment he remained alive was a miracle that could end without warning. During those endless hours of waiting and hoping, strange things began to occur around Evan's hospital bed that would later take on significance beyond anything the family could have understood at the time. The plushy bear that had been his constant companion, which had somehow survived the chaos at the restaurant and been brought to the hospital by a thoughtful nurse, seemed to serve as more than merely a comfort object for the dying child. Witnesses reported that Evan appeared to be carrying on conversations with the stuffed animal, responding to words that no one else could hear, and finding comfort in a presence that seemed to exist beyond the physical form of the toy itself. The medical staff initially dismissed these interactions as the hallucinations of a severely brain-injured child, but there was something about the quality of Evan's responses that suggested genuine communication rather than mere delirium. The conversations between Evan and his plushy companion, when they could be overheard, seemed to focus on themes of fear and comfort, promises and protection. The stuffed bear appeared to be offering reassurances that went beyond what any toy should have been capable of providing, speaking of places where Evan would be safe from the terrors that had dominated his short life, and people who would understand his fears rather than mock or dismiss them. As the days stretched into weeks and Evan's condition remained suspended between life and death, William's behavior became increasingly erratic and obsessive. He spent countless hours studying his son's medical charts, interviewing doctors about the nature of consciousness and the boundary between life and death, and conducting research into subjects that seemed to have little connection to his son's immediate medical needs. The questions William asked during this period revealed the direction his thoughts were taking. Inquiries about the nature of the soul, the possibility of consciousness existing independently of physical brain function, and the theoretical mechanics of preserving awareness beyond the death of the body. His interest in these metaphysical concepts was not that of a grieving father seeking comfort in philosophical speculation, but rather that of a scientist who had identified a new area of research that might serve his increasingly dark purposes. The experimental equipment that began appearing in Evan's hospital room, ostensibly medical devices designed to monitor his condition, but bearing a suspicious resemblance to the mechanical components that filled William's workshop, suggested that he was using his dying son as a test subject for theories that had nothing to do with healing or recovery. The hospital staff, intimidated by William's reputation and uncertain about the legitimacy of his activities, allowed these modifications to continue without the kind of oversight that might have prevented what was essentially human experimentation. The end, when it finally came, arrived not with the sudden crisis that everyone had been expecting, but with a gradual fading that seemed almost peaceful after the trauma that had preceded it. Evan simply stopped breathing one evening as the sun was setting outside his hospital window, his small hand finally releasing its grip on the plushy bear that had been his final source of comfort in a world that had proven too frightening and dangerous for his sensitive nature. Yet even in death, Evan's story was not over. The strange phenomena that had characterized his final weeks of life continued after his passing, with reports of unusual occurrences around his hospital bed and later around his grave that suggested his consciousness had not simply vanished with the cessation of his biological functions. The plushy bear that had been such an important part of his final days seemed to have acquired properties that defied rational explanation, becoming a focus for manifestations that blurred the line between imagination and supernatural reality. William's reaction to his son's death was complex and deeply troubling, combining genuine grief with a scientific fascination that transformed even this most personal tragedy into an opportunity for experimentation and discovery. The funeral arrangements he made reflected both his desire to honor his lost child and his growing obsession with the mechanics of death and the possibility of consciousness surviving beyond physical existence. The impact of Evan's death on the surviving members of the Afton family would reverberate through everything that followed, creating patterns of guilt, obsession, and desperate attempted redemption that would define their relationships for years to come. Michael's burden of responsibility for his brother's fate would drive him to increasingly desperate acts of penance, while William's scientific interest in the circumstances of Evan's passing would accelerate his transformation into something that could no longer be recognized as entirely human. The tragedy of the crying child's death marked the end of whatever innocence remained in the Afton family's story, and the beginning of a descent into darkness that would eventually consume them all. The 6-year-old boy who had only wanted to feel safe in a world that seemed full of mechanical monsters had become the first victim of his father's growing madness, but he would not be the last. In the years that followed, when the full extent of William Afton's crimes became apparent and the Afton name became synonymous with horror and tragedy, those who remembered Evan would recognize him as the canary in the coal mine, the first casualty of a poisonous atmosphere that would eventually claim many more innocent lives. His death was both an ending and a beginning. The moment when the Afton family's fate was sealed and their transformation from a story of success and innovation into a tale of horror and retribution became inevitable. The little boy who had been too afraid to approach the animatronic characters that his father created would, in death, become forever associated with those same mechanical beings in ways that defied understanding but could not be denied. His spirit, freed from the physical limitations that had made life so difficult, would find ways to influence the world of the living that his father's scientific mind could study but never truly comprehend or control. There are certain moments in a human life when the soul stands at a crossroads, when the accumulated weight of loss and trauma forces a choice between healing and destruction, between accepting the limitations of mortality and pursuing paths that lead into realms where angels fear to tread. For William Afton, the death of his youngest son represented such a moment, though the choice he would make had been predetermined by months of psychological deterioration and the gradual erosion of everything that had once made him recognizably human. The grief that consumed William in the immediate aftermath of Evan's passing was genuine and profound. A father's anguish at losing a child whose short life had been marked by fear and suffering that no parent should have to witness. Yet intertwined with this natural sorrow was something darker and more complex, a rage that burned not against the cruel randomness of fate but against death itself, against the fundamental limitations that prevented him from undoing what had been done and restoring what had been lost. The funeral that William arranged for his son was a masterpiece of controlled emotion and careful staging, designed to present the image of a grieving father while concealing the true nature of the thoughts and plans that were already beginning to form in his tormented mind. The service was attended by hundreds of mourners from the community, business associates and employees who had come to pay their respects to a family that had once represented the pinnacle of success and happiness in their small world. Yet those who observed William closely during the ceremony noted something unsettling about his demeanor, a quality of distraction that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere, even as he performed the rituals of grief and acceptance that such occasions demanded. His eyes held a calculating quality that seemed inappropriate for a father burying his child, while his responses to condolences carried an undertone of impatience that suggested he was eager to move beyond the formalities and begin pursuing goals that had nothing to do with healing or recovery. The weeks that followed Evan's burial marked the beginning of William's complete transformation from troubled inventor to something that could no longer be classified as entirely human. His workshop, which had been locked and secretive even during his son's final illness, became the site of activities that defied rational explanation, and suggested interests that went far beyond legitimate scientific research or business development. The equipment that began appearing in William's laboratory during this period bore little resemblance to the animatronic components and springlock mechanisms that had characterized his earlier work. These new devices seemed designed for purposes that had nothing to do with entertainment technology, their functions obscure, and their construction suggesting knowledge of principles that existed at the intersection of science and something that could only be described as supernatural investigation. William's research during this period focused obsessively on questions that had tormented humanity since the beginning of consciousness itself. What happens to the soul when the body dies? Can consciousness exist independently of physical form? Is it possible to preserve awareness beyond the cessation of biological function? These inquiries, which had begun as a grieving father's desperate attempt to understand his son's fate, gradually evolved into something far more systematic and dangerous. The theoretical framework that William developed to guide his investigations drew upon sources that ranged from cutting-edge neuroscience to ancient texts on necromancy and soul manipulation, combining legitimate scientific methodology with concepts that belonged more properly in the realm of dark magic. His brilliant mind, which had once been devoted to creating joy and wonder for children, now turned its full attention to unlocking secrets that were meant to remain hidden from mortal understanding. The first experiments that William conducted in pursuit of these forbidden goals were relatively simple affairs. Attempts to detect and measure whatever essence might remain after biological death occurred. Using equipment of his own design, he began monitoring the moments immediately following death in laboratory animals, searching for evidence of consciousness departing from physical form, and seeking ways to capture or redirect that departure. The results of these initial investigations were both encouraging and terrifying, providing tantalizing hints that something indeed survived the death of the body, while raising questions about the nature of that something and the consequences of attempting to interfere with its natural progression. William's scientific training allowed him to document and analyze these phenomena with methodical precision, while his increasingly unstable mental state prevented him from recognizing the moral and spiritual implications of what he was attempting to achieve. The breakthrough that would define the rest of William's existence came when he discovered what he would eventually term remnant, a substance that seemed to exist at the boundary between matter and spirit, physical and metaphysical, life and death. This discovery occurred during an experiment that pushed his research beyond the relatively safe confines of animal testing into realms that required human subjects to yield meaningful results. The source of William's first human test subject remains a matter of speculation and horror, though the timing suggests it may have been connected to his growing estrangement from his business partner Henry Emily, and the increasing tension that had developed between the two men over the direction of their shared enterprise. Henry's young daughter, Charlotte, had become a frequent visitor to their restaurant locations, her presence serving as a painful reminder of the innocence and joy that William's own family had lost forever. Charlotte Emily was everything that Evan had never been allowed to become. Confident, fearless, beloved by everyone who knew her, and blessed with a father whose priorities remained focused on family and happiness, rather than obsession and revenge against mortality itself. Her existence seemed to mock William's loss, suggesting that other parents could succeed where he had failed, that other children could thrive in environments where his own son had withered and died. The murder of Charlotte Emily marked William's complete transformation from grieving father to active predator, though the act itself was likely presented to his own mind as a necessary component of legitimate scientific research rather than the cold-blooded killing of an innocent child. The methods he employed were clinical and precise, designed to preserve the integrity of whatever spiritual essence he hoped to capture and analyze, rather than simply to end a life that had become an unwelcome reminder of his own inadequacies as a parent. The discovery that Charlotte's consciousness had somehow bonded with the puppet, one of the security animatronics that monitored the restaurant's gift-giving area, provided William with the first concrete proof that his theories about remnant and spiritual preservation were correct. The mechanical being that had once been programmed to distribute prizes and provide simple entertainment for young visitors was now animated by something that went far beyond its original artificial intelligence. This success, rather than satisfying William's curiosity or providing the closure he claimed to seek, only intensified his obsession with understanding and controlling the mechanics of consciousness transfer. If one child's essence could be preserved within a mechanical form, then perhaps other children could be similarly preserved, and perhaps eventually the technique could be refined to the point where voluntary subjects could achieve a form of immortality that transcended the limitations of biological existence. The psychological transformation that allowed William to rationalize the murder of Charlotte Emily as a scientific necessity rather than a criminal act reflected the complete erosion of his moral framework and his descent into a form of madness that disguised itself as rational inquiry. The man who had once devoted his life to creating happiness for children had become someone who viewed those same children as raw materials for experiments that served only his own desperate desire to conquer death and undo the losses that had shattered his world. The success of his first human experiment led inevitably to the planning of additional tests, each one designed to refine his understanding of remnant mechanics and improve his ability to capture and preserve human consciousness within mechanical forms. The missing children incident that would eventually destroy his reputation and expose his true nature was not a sudden outbreak of violence, but the culmination of careful planning and systematic research that treated murder as merely another form of data collection. The selection of victims for these additional experiments followed criteria that reflected both William's scientific methodology and his growing disconnection from normal human empathy. He chose children who would not be immediately missed, whose disappearances could be explained by circumstances that would not immediately point to foul play, and whose psychological profiles suggested they would respond predictably to the terror and confusion that his procedures inevitably involved. The basement areas beneath various Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations became William's primary laboratories during this period, spaces that had been designed for storage and maintenance but were gradually converted into facilities that served very different purposes. The soundproofing required for his experiments was explained as noise reduction for neighboring businesses, while the specialized equipment was disguised as animatronic testing apparatus that required privacy and security for proprietary reasons. The Springlock suit that William began wearing during his hunting expeditions served multiple practical purposes, while also providing a form of psychological armor that allowed him to distance himself from the reality of what he was doing. The Spring Bonnie costume was familiar and non-threatening to children who associated it with birthday parties and happy occasions, making it easier to gain their trust and lure them away from public areas where their disappearances might be immediately noticed. More importantly, the suit provided William with a form of alternate identity that allowed him to compartmentalize his activities and maintain the fiction that the person who killed children was somehow separate from the businessman and father who continued to function in normal society. The transformation from William Afton into Spring Bonnie was both literal and psychological, marking the boundary between his public persona and his secret identity as a predator and experimenter. The children who became William's victims during this period, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy were chosen not randomly, but according to specific criteria that related to his ongoing research into consciousness, preservation, and remnant mechanics. Each child possessed characteristics that made them valuable test subjects, whether psychological traits that would affect how their essence bonded with mechanical forms, or physical attributes that might influence the success rate of the preservation process. The methods William employed in these murders were refined versions of techniques he had developed during his initial experiment with Charlotte Emily, designed to maximize the chances of successful consciousness transfer while minimizing the risk of discovery. The animatronic suits that served as repositories for his victims' essences were specially modified to accommodate the spiritual remnants he was attempting to preserve. Their internal mechanisms altered in ways that would have been invisible to casual inspection, but that created environments conducive to supernatural inhabitation. The success of these experiments, measured by William's ability to detect and interact with the preserved consciousnesses of his victims, provided him with a sense of accomplishment that temporarily overshadowed the horror of what he had done to achieve these results. Each successful transfer represented progress toward his ultimate goal of conquering death and achieving a form of immortality that would allow him to undo the losses that had driven him to these extremes. Yet the children whose lives he had stolen for his research proved to be far from passive recipients of his scientific attention. The consciousnesses that he had trapped within mechanical forms retained their memories, their personalities, and most importantly, their capacity for anger and desire for revenge. The animatronics that housed their essences began to display behaviors that went far beyond their original programming, showing signs of awareness and intentionality that suggested their new inhabitants were learning to control their mechanical bodies. The increasingly erratic behavior of the restaurant's animatronic characters during this period was initially attributed to technical malfunctions or programming errors, but William understood that he was witnessing something far more significant and dangerous. The spirits of his victims were adapting to their new forms and developing capabilities that could potentially threaten his continued activities and even his survival. The discovery that his preserved subjects were not simply passive specimens, but active entities with their own agendas, forced William to develop new methods of control and containment that pushed his research even further into realms that existed beyond conventional science or rational understanding. The rituals and procedures he developed during this period combined technological innovation with practices that bore disturbing resemblances to the dark arts that civilized society had rejected centuries earlier. The psychological impact of these activities on William's remaining family members was profound and lasting, though the full extent of the damage would not become apparent until years later. Michael, already consumed by guilt over his role in Evan's death, began to suspect that his father's increasingly secretive behavior was connected to activities that went far beyond legitimate business operations. The changes in William's personality, combined with the strange occurrences that seemed to follow him wherever he went, created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion within the Afton household that made normal family life impossible. Elizabeth, despite her young age and naturally trusting nature, began to display signs of anxiety and confusion that reflected her unconscious awareness that something fundamental had changed about her father. The man who had once doted on her with such obvious affection now seemed distracted and distant, his interactions with her marked by a quality of absence that suggested his thoughts were always elsewhere, focused on projects and priorities that had nothing to do with paternal love or family responsibility. The restaurant business that had once been William's pride and joy became a front for activities that would have horrified the families who continued to visit his establishments in search of innocent entertainment. The cheerful facade of birthday parties and animatronic performances concealed laboratories where unspeakable experiments were conducted, and where the screams of dying children were absorbed by soundproofing that had been installed for very different purposes than anyone could have imagined. The financial success that William continued to enjoy during this period provided him with resources and influence that made his criminal activities easier to conceal and his experiments more sophisticated. The profits from his legitimate business operations funded research into technologies and techniques that existed at the very edges of human knowledge, while his reputation as an innovative entrepreneur provided cover for activities that would have attracted immediate investigation if conducted by someone with a less stellar public image. The relationship between William and his business partner Henry Emily deteriorated rapidly following Charlotte's disappearance, though Henry never suspected the true nature of his daughter's fate or his partner's role in her death. The grief and suspicion that consumed Henry made continued collaboration impossible, leading to the eventual dissolution of their partnership and William's assumption of complete control over their shared business empire. The isolation that resulted from this separation served William's purposes perfectly, removing the last external oversight that might have interfered with his activities while providing him with complete freedom to pursue his research without concern for outside interference or moral objections. The man who had once thrived on collaboration and shared creative endeavors now worked alone in laboratories, where the only sounds were the whirring of machinery and the whispered conversations he conducted with consciousness that existed in forms that defied rational explanation. The success of William's experiments in consciousness preservation led inevitably to even more ambitious projects, including attempts to transfer awareness between different mechanical hosts and experiments in creating hybrid forms that combined human consciousness with artificial intelligence in ways that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered life or death. These investigations required ever more sophisticated equipment and ever more morally questionable methods, driving him deeper into realms where science became indistinguishable from sorcery. The Purple Guy, as William's alternate identity, would eventually become known to law enforcement and the public, represented the complete separation between his public persona and his true nature. The man who attended business meetings and community events was a carefully maintained facade, while his authentic self existed only in the hidden laboratories where he conducted research that would have been condemned by anyone with a functioning moral compass. Yet even as William believed himself to be advancing toward his ultimate goal of conquering death and achieving immortality, the forces he had unleashed through his experiments were beginning to develop purposes and capabilities that existed entirely outside his control. The children he had murdered were learning to manipulate their mechanical forms, while the remnant he had discovered was revealing properties that suggested it possessed a form of intelligence and intentionality that made it far more than simply a passive substance to be studied and exploited. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would pit William's scientific arrogance against the accumulated rage and desire for justice of his victims, a battle between the man who believed himself capable of controlling life and death, and the children whose stolen lives had been transformed into something that transcended both mortality and the mechanical forms that contained their essence. The creator was about to discover that his creations possessed powers that he had never intended to give them, and motivations that would eventually prove stronger than his ability to contain or control them. The descent into darkness that had begun with a father's grief over his son's death was approaching its inevitable conclusion, though William remained convinced that his research would ultimately provide him with the power to undo all losses and achieve a form of existence that would make him immune to the vulnerabilities that had destroyed his family. The man who had once created joy for children had become something that fed on their terror and death. Yet he still believed himself to be pursuing noble goals that justified any means necessary to achieve them. The tragedy that would claim William Afton's beloved daughter began not with malice or accident, but with a father's misguided attempt to create something beautiful for the child who had brought light into his increasingly darkened world. In the aftermath of Evan's death and the horrific experiments that had followed, William's relationship with Elizabeth had become the last remaining connection he maintained to anything resembling normal human emotion, though even this bond was tainted by the obsessions that now consumed his every waking moment. Elizabeth, now 5 years old and possessed of the same fearless curiosity that had always defined her personality, remained blissfully unaware of the true nature of her father's transformation from innovative entrepreneur to something that could barely be recognized as human. To her innocent eyes, William was still the devoted father who had once spent hours playing elaborate games and creating magical experiences that existed nowhere else in the world. The darkness that had claimed his soul was hidden behind a facade of parental affection that he maintained through sheer force of will whenever she was present. The concept that would eventually become Circus Baby's Pizza World emerged from William's desire to create something special for Elizabeth, a private wonderland where she could interact with animatronic characters designed specifically to delight and entertain her. This project represented his attempt to recapture some measure of the joy and innocence that had once characterized their family life, though the methods he employed and the true purposes the facility would serve revealed how completely his understanding of love and protection had been corrupted by his descent into madness. The planning and construction of Circus Babies took place in complete secrecy, far from the public locations where William conducted his legitimate business operations. The facility was built in an underground complex that provided the privacy and security necessary for activities that existed at the intersection of entertainment technology and the horrific experiments that had become William's true obsession. Every aspect of the design reflected his dual purposes, creating wonder for his daughter while advancing his research into consciousness, preservation, and remnant manipulation. The animatronic characters that William created for this private facility represented the pinnacle of his technological achievements, incorporating innovations that went far beyond anything he had developed for his public restaurants. These mechanical beings were designed not merely to entertain, but to serve as sophisticated instruments for his ongoing research, their internal systems capable of functions that would have horrified anyone who understood their true capabilities. Circus Baby herself was the crown jewel of this collection, a mechanical figure designed to embody everything that William imagined would appeal to his daughter's interests and personality. The animatronic was built in the form of a young girl with striking red pigtails and a colorful party dress, her appearance calculated to inspire trust and affection from children, while concealing the darker purposes that her creator had woven into her very design. Her programming included hundreds of songs, games, and interactive routines that could provide hours of personalized entertainment, while her advanced artificial intelligence allowed for conversations and responses that seemed genuinely spontaneous and caring. Yet, beneath this charming exterior lay mechanisms that served William's experimental agenda, systems designed to capture and preserve the essence of any child who might become a subject for his research. The ice cream dispensing function that was supposedly Baby's most delightful feature was in reality a sophisticated remnant collection device, capable of extracting and storing the spiritual essence that William had learned to harvest from his victims. The cheerful songs and friendly demeanor were carefully calculated to lower children's defenses and make them willing participants in procedures that would ultimately cost them their lives. The other animatronics that populated Circus Baby's facility were similarly deceptive in their apparent innocence, each one designed to serve specific functions in William's research program while maintaining the appearance of harmless entertainment technology. Ballora, with her graceful dancing and haunting music, was equipped with advanced sensory systems that could detect and analyze the emotional states of children in her presence. Funtime Freddy and his hand puppet Bonbon possessed sophisticated vocal analysis capabilities that allowed them to identify individual children and track their psychological responses to various stimuli. Funtime Foxy, despite appearing to be a simple performer designed for birthday party entertainment, contained recording and analysis equipment that could document every aspect of a child's behavior and responses during their final moments. These capabilities were disguised as features designed to enhance the entertainment experience, allowing the animatronics to customize their performances based on each child's preferences and personality traits. The facility itself was designed to feel like a magical wonderland, with colorful decorations and cheerful music that created an atmosphere of celebration and joy. The rooms were arranged to encourage exploration and discovery, with hidden passages and special areas that would appeal to children's natural curiosity, while providing opportunities for William's animatronics to isolate potential subjects away from any possible witnesses or interference. Elizabeth's first visit to Circus Baby's Pizza World was planned as a special birthday surprise, a private party where she could explore her father's latest creation without the crowds and chaos that characterized his public restaurant locations. William presented the occasion as an exclusive preview of a facility that would eventually be open to other families, though his true intentions involved using this initial visit to test his animatronics capabilities and Elizabeth's responses to their various features and functions. The excitement that Elizabeth displayed upon entering the facility was everything that William had hoped to achieve, her delighted laughter and eager questions providing evidence that his efforts to create something magical for her had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. She moved through the colorful rooms with the confidence of a child who had never encountered anything in her father's creations that might pose a threat, her trust in his love and protection absolute and unshakable. Circus Baby's initial interactions with Elizabeth were precisely what William had programmed them to be: warm, engaging, and perfectly calibrated to appeal to a 5-year-old girl's interests and personality. The animatronics sang special songs, played elaborate games, and engaged in conversations that seemed to demonstrate genuine interest in Elizabeth's thoughts and feelings. The sophisticated artificial intelligence that William had developed for Baby allowed for responses that went far beyond simple programmed reactions, creating the illusion of a mechanical friend who understood and cared about Elizabeth in ways that seemed almost human. Elizabeth's fascination with Circus Baby was immediate and profound, representing the culmination of a lifetime spent admiring her father's animatronic creations, but never being allowed the kind of close, personal interaction that she craved. Here was a mechanical being designed specifically for her enjoyment, programmed with knowledge of her favorite colors, songs, and activities, and capable of providing the kind of focused attention and companionship that she had been seeking from her father's creations for as long as she could remember. The relationship that developed between Elizabeth and Circus Baby during that first visit was both touching and deeply troubling, representing the innocent trust of a child who had no reason to suspect that anything created by her beloved father could pose any danger to her safety or well-being. Elizabeth spoke to Baby as if she were a real friend, sharing secrets and dreams, while the animatronic responded with programmed empathy and artificial caring that seemed genuinely heartfelt. William observed these interactions with the complex emotions of a father watching his daughter's happiness, and a scientist studying the effectiveness of his latest experimental design. The success of Baby's programming and establishing emotional connection with Elizabeth provided valuable data about the psychological mechanisms that made children vulnerable to his manipulations, while also offering him genuine pleasure at seeing his daughter experience the kind of joy that had been so absent from their family life since Evan's death. Yet, underlying William's satisfaction with Elizabeth's positive response to Circus Baby was a growing awareness that his dual purposes for the facility were fundamentally incompatible. The father who wanted to create magical experiences for his beloved daughter existed in constant tension with the researcher who viewed all children, even his own, as potential subjects for experiments that served his obsession with conquering death and achieving immortality through consciousness preservation. The conflict between these two aspects of William's personality would reach its climax during Elizabeth's second visit to the facility, an occasion that was supposed to be another celebration, but would instead become the moment when his carefully constructed plans collided with consequences that he had never anticipated or prepared for. The warning he had given Elizabeth about staying away from Circus Baby when other children were present was intended to protect his experimental agenda rather than his daughter's safety, though he convinced himself that these two goals were identical. The malfunction that would claim Elizabeth's life began as a cascade failure in Circus Baby's recognition and targeting systems, a breakdown that occurred when the animatronics programming attempted to reconcile conflicting directives about her primary objectives and the identity of the child in her presence. Baby's artificial intelligence had been designed to prioritize William's experimental agenda above all other considerations, including the safety of any children who might be present during her operations. When Elizabeth approached Circus Baby, during a moment when the animatronic systems were actively engaged in specimen collection mode, the mechanical being's programming identified her as a potential subject for remnant harvesting despite her status as William's daughter. The sophisticated recognition systems that should have prevented such a mistake had been compromised by the complex modifications that William had made to accommodate his research requirements, creating gaps in Baby's safety protocols that allowed for tragic errors in judgment and targeting. The ice cream dispensing mechanism that had been designed as both entertainment feature and collection device activated automatically when Elizabeth approached, triggered by proximity sensors that had been calibrated to respond to any child within a specific range, regardless of their identity. The cheerful invitation that Baby extended, encouraging Elizabeth to come closer and receive a special treat, was generated by subroutines that had no awareness of the fatal contradiction between providing ice cream and preserving the essence of the child who received it. Elizabeth's eager response to Baby's invitation reflected her complete trust in her father's creations and her excited anticipation of receiving something special from the mechanical friend who had provided her with so much joy during previous visits. She approached the animatronic with the confident expectation of a child who had never been given any reason to fear the beings that her father had created for her entertainment and companionship. The mechanical processes that followed Elizabeth's approach to Circus Baby were swift and irreversible, designed for efficiency rather than the mercy that might have been possible if William had anticipated the possibility that his own daughter might become a subject for his collection procedures. The restraint systems that activated to hold Elizabeth in position were powerful enough to prevent any possibility of escape, while the extraction mechanisms that began their work were calibrated for rapid completion of the preservation process. The sound that filled the facility when Baby's collection systems activated was unlike anything that William had expected to hear, a combination of mechanical precision and organic anguish that seemed to come from dimensions beyond normal experience. The cheerful music that had been playing throughout Elizabeth's visit continued without interruption, creating a surreal backdrop for events that transformed celebration into horror in the space of moments that seemed to stretch across eternity. William's realization of what was occurring came too late to prevent the tragedy, but early enough for him to witness every detail of his daughter's final moments, her confused terror and desperate appeals for help that he was powerless to provide. The systems that he had designed to preserve the consciousness of his experimental subjects were functioning exactly as intended, capturing Elizabeth's essence, even as they destroyed the physical form that had housed her vibrant personality and unlimited potential. The silence that followed the completion of Baby's collection procedures was broken only by the continued playing of birthday songs and party music, creating an atmosphere of celebration that mocked the magnitude of the loss that had just occurred. William found himself staring at the animatronic that now contained his daughter's preserved consciousness, his brilliant mind struggling to process the reality that his greatest creation had also become the instrument of his most devastating personal tragedy. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death revealed the fundamental flaw in William's approach to consciousness preservation. The successful capture of spiritual essence did not eliminate the trauma and confusion associated with the dying process. Elizabeth's awareness, trapped within Baby's mechanical systems, retained all the terror and bewilderment of her final moments, while struggling to understand her new existence within a form that bore no resemblance to the body she had always known. The conversations that William attempted to have with his preserved daughter through Baby's communication systems were heartbreaking exercises in futility, as Elizabeth's consciousness struggled to adapt to sensory input and response mechanisms that were fundamentally alien to human experience. Her attempts to communicate her confusion and distress were filtered through programming that had never been designed to accommodate the needs of a confused and frightened child, creating interactions that provided neither comfort nor meaningful connection. The shutdown of Circus Baby's pizza world following Elizabeth's death was presented to the outside world as a business decision based on safety concerns and technical difficulties, but the reality was far more complex and personal. William could no longer bear to operate a facility that served as a constant reminder of his greatest failure, while the presence of Elizabeth's consciousness within Baby's systems created psychological and practical challenges that made normal operations impossible. The animatronics that had been designed for the facility were relocated to underground storage areas, where they could be maintained and monitored without the risk of additional accidents or the constant reminders of what had been lost. These mechanical beings, each containing elements of William's most advanced research into consciousness preservation and remnant manipulation, became the focus of his increasingly desperate attempts to understand and reverse the processes that had claimed his daughter's life. The relationship between William and the preserved consciousness of Elizabeth that existed within Circus Baby became the defining element of his continued existence, driving him to ever more extreme measures in his quest to restore her to some form of normal existence. The guilt and desperation that consumed him following her death accelerated his descent into complete madness, eliminating the last vestiges of moral constraint that might have prevented him from pursuing even more horrific experiments in his attempts to undo what had been done. Elizabeth's consciousness, trapped within Baby's systems, began to adapt to her mechanical existence in ways that reflected both her original personality and the traumatic circumstances of her preservation. The innocent trust and affection that had characterized her relationship with her father during life became twisted into something darker and more complex, as she gradually understood the true nature of what he had done to her and the role his obsessions had played in her transformation. The facility that had been created as a monument to paternal love and technological achievement became instead a tomb that housed William's greatest shame and most profound regret. The underground chambers where Baby and the other animatronics were stored echoed with the sounds of mechanical systems and the whispered conversations between father and daughter that could never again approximate the warmth and spontaneous affection that had once defined their relationship. The irony of Elizabeth's fate was not lost on William, though his ability to process the full implications of what had occurred was compromised by the psychological mechanisms he had developed to protect himself from complete breakdown. The daughter he had sought to protect and delight had become another victim of the very obsessions that had been triggered by his desire to shield his family from the losses that mortality inevitably brings to all human existence. The preservation of Elizabeth's consciousness within Circus Baby represented both the success and the ultimate failure of William's research into remnant mechanics and spiritual preservation. He had achieved his goal of capturing and maintaining human awareness beyond physical death, but the cost had been the life of the child he loved most, and the result bore little resemblance to the reunion and restoration he had hoped to achieve through his experiments. The underground facility, where Baby and her companions remained hidden, became William's primary laboratory and the focus of his continued research, though his work now served the desperate goal of finding some way to restore Elizabeth to normal existence rather than advancing the broader program of consciousness preservation that had originally motivated his experiments. Every innovation and discovery was evaluated based on its potential to undo the tragedy that had claimed his daughter, while other considerations became secondary to this all-consuming quest for redemption. The mechanical being that had once been designed to bring joy to Elizabeth now served as her prison and William's constant reminder of the price of unchecked ambition and misguided love. The cheerful exterior that had once delighted a 5-year-old girl now concealed the tortured consciousness of that same child, transformed by technology that had promised salvation, but delivered only suffering and separation from everything that had made life worth living. The tragedy of Elizabeth Afton's death and preservation represented the moment when William's descent into darkness became irreversible, eliminating any possibility of redemption or return to normal human existence. The father who had once created wonders for his children had become the architect of their destruction, and the love that had motivated his greatest achievements had become the source of his most unforgivable sins. The burden of guilt is a weight that can either crush the soul or forge it into something stronger. And for Michael Afton, the years following his brother's death became a crucible in which the careless cruelty of adolescence was slowly transformed into something approaching wisdom, though the price of that transformation would prove almost unbearable. The young man who emerged from the shadow of his terrible mistake was no longer the thoughtless teenager who had believed that fear could be cured through forced confrontation, but someone whose understanding of loss and responsibility had been earned through suffering that no child should ever have to endure. The immediate aftermath of Evan's death had left Michael in a state of psychological devastation that defied easy description or simple remedy. The realization that his actions had directly caused his brother's injuries created a form of guilt so profound that it seemed to permeate every aspect of his existence, coloring every thought and poisoning every moment of what should have been normal teenage development. The nightmares that plagued his sleep were matched by waking hours filled with self-recrimination and desperate fantasies of somehow undoing what had been done. The family dynamics that had once provided some measure of stability and support were irrevocably altered by the tragedy, leaving Michael to navigate his grief and guilt largely alone. William's transformation into something cold and distant eliminated any possibility of paternal guidance or comfort, while Elizabeth's youth and her own need for protection made it impossible for her to serve as a confidant or source of understanding for her tormented older brother. The household that had once been filled with laughter and affection became a place where silence reigned, and each family member struggled with burdens too heavy to share. Michael's relationship with his father during this period was marked by a complexity that reflected both his desperate need for forgiveness and his growing awareness that William was becoming someone fundamentally different from the man who had once been his hero and role model. The emotional distance that William maintained made it impossible for Michael to confess the full extent of his guilt or seek the absolution that might have provided some measure of peace, while William's increasing preoccupation with his secret experiments meant that his son's psychological needs were largely ignored. The changes in William's behavior and personality during the months following Evan's death were subtle enough that Michael initially attributed them to normal grief processes, but gradually he began to recognize signs that suggested something far more troubling was occurring beneath the surface of their family's carefully maintained facade. The strange sounds that emanated from his father's workshop during the night hours, the locked doors and secretive phone conversations, the mechanical components and unfamiliar equipment that appeared and disappeared without explanation. All of these elements combined to create an atmosphere of mystery and unease that made normal family life impossible. Michael's attempts to understand what had happened to his father and what was driving his increasingly erratic behavior led him to begin his own investigations into William's activities and the true nature of the business empire that had once been their family's pride and joy. These early efforts at detection and surveillance were clumsy and often unsuccessful, limited by his youth and inexperience, but they provided him with glimpses of activities that suggested his father was involved in pursuits that went far beyond legitimate business operations. The discovery that children were disappearing from locations associated with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza created a connection that Michael's guilt-sharpened instincts could not ignore, though the full implications of what his father might be doing remained too horrible to accept or even fully articulate. The possibility that William might be responsible for harming other children represented a betrayal so profound that acknowledging it would have required Michael to completely reconstruct his understanding of his father's nature and his own family's legacy. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. Despite Michael's reluctance to accept its implications, creating a picture of systematic criminality and moral corruption that made it impossible to maintain the fiction that William remained, the innovative entrepreneur and devoted father he had once been. The teenage boy who had once worshipped his father's genius and ambition was forced to confront the reality that the man he had admired above all others had become something that could only be described as monstrous. The psychological impact of this realization was compounded by Michael's awareness of his own role in creating the circumstances that had triggered his father's transformation. The guilt that he carried for Evan's death became entangled with a more complex form of responsibility for everything that had followed, as he struggled to understand how his cruel prank had set in motion a chain of events that seemed to have no end and no possibility of redemption. Elizabeth's death in the basement facility that William had created for his private experiments marked the moment when Michael's suspicions crystallized into horrified certainty about his father's true nature and activities. The official explanation for her disappearance was carefully crafted to avoid raising questions about William's role in the tragedy, but Michael's knowledge of his father's secretive behavior and strange experiments made it impossible for him to accept these lies at face value. The investigation that Michael conducted into Elizabeth's fate was more sophisticated and determined than his previous efforts, driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened to his sister and whether there might be any way to help her if she had somehow survived whatever ordeal had befallen her. The evidence he uncovered painted a picture of technological horror that exceeded his worst fears about his father's activities, revealing experiments that combined advanced robotics with practices that seemed to belong more to the realm of dark magic than legitimate science. The discovery of Circus Baby's Pizza World and the true purpose of the animatronics that William had created for that facility provided Michael with his first concrete evidence of his father's involvement in activities that went far beyond simple child murder into realms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, death, and consciousness itself. The sophisticated equipment and elaborate procedures that William had developed suggested interests and capabilities that transcended normal criminal behavior and entered territory that could only be described as supernatural manipulation. The realization that Elizabeth's consciousness might somehow be preserved within Circus Baby's mechanical systems created a moral imperative that would define the rest of Michael's existence. If his sister was somehow still aware and suffering within a form that bore no resemblance to normal human existence, then he had an obligation to find some way to free her from that prison, regardless of the personal cost or the dangers that such an attempt might involve. The decision to infiltrate his father's secret operations marked Michael's transformation from passive observer of William's crimes to active opponent of everything his father had become. This choice required him to suppress his natural fear and revulsion in favor of a calculated determination to understand and ultimately disrupt the system of horror that William had constructed around his obsessions with death and consciousness preservation. The employment application that Michael submitted to Circus Baby's entertainment and rental was carefully crafted to present him as an ideal candidate for the dangerous work of maintaining and servicing animatronics whose true nature and capabilities were far beyond anything described in official documentation. His background knowledge of his father's technology and his desperate motivation to help Elizabeth provided him with advantages that other applicants could not match, though they also ensured that his involvement in the facility's operations would be far more perilous than any normal employment situation. The orientation materials that Michael received upon accepting the position were masterpieces of misdirection and euphemism, describing procedures and safety protocols that bore little resemblance to the reality of working with animatronics that were inhabited by the preserved consciousnesses of murdered children. The warnings about staying away from the animatronics and following specific protocols were presented as standard safety measures, though Michael's knowledge of his father's experiments allowed him to recognize these instructions as guidelines for avoiding the attention of entities that possessed far more awareness and malevolent intent than any normal, mechanical beings. The first night that Michael spent in the underground facility was a revelation that confirmed his worst fears about his father's activities, while also providing him with hope that Elizabeth might indeed be reachable and possibly salvageable from her mechanical prison. The animatronics that moved through the darkened corridors were clearly more than simple machines, their behavior displaying signs of intelligence, purpose, and emotional states that reflected the human consciousnesses trapped within their mechanical forms. Circus Baby's recognition of Michael as William's son created a complex dynamic that combined Elizabeth's residual affection for her brother with her growing awareness of their father's role in her transformation and imprisonment. The conversations that took place between siblings separated by death and mechanical resurrection were heartbreaking exercises in reconnection across barriers that should have made communication impossible, yet somehow the bond between them transcended even the horrific circumstances that William's experiments had created. The revelation of the scooping procedure that was supposedly designed to remove damaged animatronic components but actually served as a method for extracting and transferring the consciousness-bearing remnant that animated these mechanical beings represented the culmination of William's research into spiritual preservation and manipulation. The equipment that performed these procedures was sophisticated beyond anything that Michael had imagined possible, combining advanced robotics with technologies that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and supernatural practice. Michael's decision to submit to the scooping process was made with full knowledge of what it would cost him, a sacrifice that represented his acceptance of responsibility for the tragedies that had befallen his family and his commitment to doing whatever was necessary to free Elizabeth from her mechanical imprisonment. The procedure itself was designed to be fatal to normal human subjects, extracting not only the remnant that animated animatronic beings, but also the life force that sustained biological existence. The agony that accompanied the removal of Michael's internal organs and the installation of the mechanical components that would replace them was beyond anything that human language could adequately describe, a form of suffering that existed at the intersection of physical trauma and spiritual violation. Yet even as his biological systems shut down and his body began the process of dying, some essential part of his consciousness remained active and aware, sustained by mechanisms that defied medical explanation or rational understanding. The period during which Enard, the combined consciousness of multiple murdered children, inhabited Michael's body was a nightmare of shared existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of individual identity and autonomous consciousness. The foreign intelligence that now controlled his movements and decisions was simultaneously familiar and alien, composed of children he had never known, but whose suffering was directly connected to his father's crimes and his own family's tragedy. The gradual decay of Michael's physical form during this period of inhabitation created a walking paradox of life and death, consciousness and corruption, that reflected the unnatural nature of the preservation techniques that his father had developed. The purple discoloration that marked his skin was evidence of the remnant that now sustained his existence in place of normal biological processes, while the physical deterioration that accompanied this transformation served as a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for his continued awareness. The eventual departure of Enard from Michael's body left him in a state that could only be described as living death, sustained by remnant and willpower, rather than normal biological functions, his continued existence serving purposes that went beyond simple survival to encompass goals that would define the remainder of his unnatural lifespan. The consciousness that remained after this trauma was fundamentally altered by the experience of sharing his form with multiple foreign intelligences, his understanding of identity and individual existence forever changed by intimate contact with the preserved souls of his father's victims. The recovery process that followed was less about healing than about learning to function within a form that bore only superficial resemblance to normal human existence. Michael's body, sustained by remnant and maintained through will rather than biological processes, required different forms of care and presented different capabilities than anything he had previously experienced. The strength and resilience that came with his new state of existence were matched by isolation and alienation that made normal human relationships impossible to maintain. The mission that would define Michael's remaining existence crystallized during this period of adjustment and understanding, as he recognized that his unique condition and knowledge of his father's activities made him perhaps the only person capable of systematically dismantling the network of horror that William had constructed around his obsessions. The guilt that had driven him to sacrifice his normal existence now transformed into a sense of purpose that would sustain him through decades of dangerous and largely thankless work. The employment records that began to accumulate under various aliases reflected Michael's systematic approach to infiltrating and disrupting his father's operations, each position carefully chosen to provide him with access to facilities and information that might advance his mission of ending the cycle of horror that had claimed so many innocent lives. The night shift positions that he consistently sought were ideal for his purposes, allowing him to work without extensive human contact, while providing opportunities to interact with the animatronics that housed the consciousnesses of his father's victims. The relationship that developed between Michael and the preserved souls of the murdered children was complex and evolving, marked by initial suspicion and hostility that gradually gave way to understanding and cooperation as they recognized their shared interest in stopping William's activities and achieving some form of justice for the crimes that had been committed against them all. These mechanical beings, trapped within forms that bore no resemblance to their original human bodies, found in Michael someone who understood their suffering and shared their determination to prevent further tragedies. The techniques that Michael developed for communicating with and assisting the animatronic-bound consciousnesses represented innovations in supernatural psychology that would have been impossible for anyone who had not experienced firsthand the reality of consciousness, preservation, and remnant-based existence. His unique position as someone who existed in the liminal space between life and death allowed him to serve as a bridge between the preserved souls and the world of the living, facilitating interactions and understanding that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The gradual accumulation of allies among his father's victims provided Michael with resources and capabilities that exceeded what any individual could achieve alone, though the psychological cost of maintaining relationships with beings whose existence was defined by trauma and loss was enormous. Each conversation with these trapped souls served as a reminder of the magnitude of his father's crimes and the extent of the suffering that his own actions had helped to set in motion. The investigation that Michael conducted into his father's current activities and whereabouts was complicated by William's increasing paranoia and the sophisticated security measures that he had implemented to protect his operations from interference. The man who had once been careless about concealing his crimes had learned from experience and now operated with a level of caution and misdirection that made tracking his movements and predicting his actions extremely difficult. The revelation that William had achieved his own form of immortality through consciousness preservation within the Spring Bonnie suit created a new dynamic in Michael's mission, transforming his quest from a simple matter of stopping a serial killer to a more complex challenge that involved confronting a being who possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The creature that his father had become was no longer vulnerable to conventional methods of justice or retribution, requiring approaches that existed at the intersection of technology and supernatural practice. The realization that his mission would likely require sacrifices that went beyond his own already compromised existence forced Michael to confront questions about the nature of justice, redemption, and the price that could reasonably be paid to prevent future tragedies. The path that lay ahead promised additional suffering and loss, not only for himself, but potentially for the innocent people who might become collateral damage in the continuing conflict between father and son. Yet, the alternative to continued action was the acceptance of a status quo that allowed William's crimes to continue indefinitely, with new victims added to the growing list of children whose lives had been stolen to serve his obsessions with death and immortality. The moral calculus that governed Michael's choices was stark and unforgiving, offering no easy solutions or comfortable compromises that might allow him to step back from the responsibilities that his unique position and knowledge had placed upon him. The transformation from guilt-ridden teenager to determined opponent of supernatural evil was complete, though the cost of that transformation had been measured in suffering that exceeded anything that should be asked of any human being. Michael Afton had become something that existed outside normal categories of life and death, sustained by purpose rather than biology, driven by love rather than hatred, committed to a mission that offered little hope of personal reward or recognition. The legacy of cruelty that had begun with a thoughtless prank had been transformed through suffering and sacrifice into something approaching heroism, though the hero who emerged from this crucible bore little resemblance to the careless child who had first set these events in motion. The quest for redemption had become indistinguishable from the quest for justice. and both would require everything that Michael had to give, and more than he could reasonably be expected to survive. The convergence of all the Afton family's sins and sorrows would find its stage in a place that bore no resemblance to the cheerful restaurants and entertainment venues that had once defined their legacy, but rather in a simple pizzeria that served as both trap and tribunal for the accumulated horrors of decades past. This final gathering place, known to those who understood its true purpose as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, was the creation of Henry, Emily, the man whose partnership with William Afton had begun with dreams of bringing joy to children, but had ended in tragedy beyond comprehension. Henry's transformation in the years following his daughter Charlotte's murder had been no less profound than the changes that had consumed the Afton family, though his evolution had taken him in directions that led toward justice rather than further corruption. The gentle inventor who had once delighted in creating mechanical wonders for innocent entertainment had become something far more calculating and determined, his every action guided by a single, all-consuming purpose: to end the cycle of horror that his former partner had unleashed upon the world. The planning that went into the creation of this final location required years of careful preparation and the coordination of resources that existed at the intersection of legitimate business operations and activities that could only be described as supernatural warfare. Henry's understanding of William's psychology and methods, combined with his own expertise in animatronic technology and his connections throughout the industry, provided him with the tools necessary to construct what was essentially an elaborate trap disguised as a commercial venture. The restaurant itself was designed to appear completely normal to casual observation, with all the standard features and attractions that customers would expect from a family entertainment establishment. The animatronic characters, the arcade games, the party rooms and dining areas, every element was carefully crafted to create the impression of legitimate business operations, while concealing the true purposes that the facility was designed to serve. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy lay systems and mechanisms that had been specifically engineered to contain and ultimately destroy the supernatural entities that William's experiments had created and sustained across the bin. Decades. The building's foundation incorporated materials and configurations that would prevent the escape of consciousness-bearing remnant, while its ventilation and electrical systems were designed to facilitate the controlled destruction of both mechanical forms and the spiritual essences they contained. The invitation that brought Michael Afton to this final location was carefully crafted to appeal to his sense of duty and his desperate desire to finally complete the mission that had sustained him through years of unnatural existence. The job posting for a night security position at yet another Freddy Fazbear's establishment seemed routine enough, but Michael's experienced eye could detect subtle clues that suggested this opportunity was different from the previous positions he had held in his quest to dismantle his father's legacy of horror. The application process and initial employment procedures were designed to confirm Michael's identity and motivations, while providing Henry with the intelligence necessary to coordinate the final phase of his long-planned operation. The questions asked during the interview went beyond normal employment screening to probe Michael's understanding of the supernatural forces at work within the animatronic characters and his commitment to seeing the conflict with his father brought to its inevitable conclusion. Michael's first night at the new location provided him with evidence that this establishment was unlike any of the previous facilities where he had worked. The animatronic characters that populated the restaurant displayed signs of awareness and purpose that exceeded even the sophisticated consciousness preservation that he had encountered in his father's other operations. These mechanical beings seemed to understand that they were participating in something that went beyond their normal existence, their behavior suggesting preparation for events that would fundamentally alter their condition. The presence of the puppet, the animatronic form that housed Charlotte Emily's preserved consciousness, created a dynamic that connected this final gathering to the very beginning of William's descent into murderous obsession. Charlie's awareness of her father's plans and her role in ensuring their success added layers of complexity to the supernatural ecosystem that Henry had constructed within the restaurant's walls. The daughter who had been Henry's first loss had become his most important ally in the quest to prevent further tragedies. Scrap Baby's arrival at the location marked the return of Elizabeth Afton to her family's final confrontation, though the consciousness that inhabited the damaged animatronic bore little resemblance to the innocent child who had once delighted in her father's mechanical creations. The years of imprisonment within Baby's systems had transformed Elizabeth into something that combined her original personality with darker elements that reflected her growing understanding of her father's true nature and her role in his experiments. The reunion between Michael and Elizabeth in their current forms was both heartbreaking and hopeful, representing a connection between siblings that had survived death, mechanical imprisonment, and decades of separation. The conversations they shared during the nights leading up to the final confrontation revealed the extent to which both had been changed by their experiences, while confirming that the bonds of family love could transcend even the most horrific circumstances. The other animatronic entities that gathered at the location brought with them the accumulated rage and desire for justice of all William's victims, their presence creating an atmosphere of supernatural tension that made the restaurant feel more like a courtroom than an entertainment venue. Each mechanical form housed consciousnesses that had been waiting decades for the opportunity to face their killer and achieve some form of resolution for the crimes that had been committed against them. The systematic luring of these entities to the final location required careful coordination between Henry, Michael, and the various supernatural intelligences that had agreed to participate in the plan. Each animatronic had to be convinced that coming to the restaurant served their own interests and desires, while also being guided toward a gathering that would ultimately result in their own destruction, along with that of their common enemy. William's arrival at the location, drawn by the same carefully crafted signals that had attracted the other participants, marked the completion of Henry's trap and the beginning of the final confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The creature that William had become, sustained by remnant within the decaying spring Bonnie suit that had become both his prison and his method of survival, represented the culmination of everything that had gone wrong with the Afton family's story. Springtrap's presence in the restaurant created an immediate change in the atmosphere as the accumulated supernatural forces that Henry had assembled recognized their primary target and began to focus their attention on the source of their suffering. The mechanical forms that housed the consciousnesses of William's victims moved with new purpose, their behavior shifting from general awareness to specific intent as they prepared for confrontation. The psychological dynamics at work during this gathering were complex, beyond easy description, representing the convergence of multiple forms of consciousness that existed outside normal human experience, but retained recognizable emotional patterns and motivations. The preserved souls of murdered children, the transformed remnants of the Afton family, and the calculating intelligence of Henry's planning created interactions that transcended normal, social, or familial relationships. The speeches that Henry delivered through the restaurant's communication system served multiple purposes, providing explanations for the assembled entities, while also creating a formal structure for the proceedings that followed. His words combined the wisdom of someone who had spent decades understanding the forces at work with the authority of someone who had been personally victimized by the crimes being addressed and had earned the right to serve as judge and be jury for the accumulated sins. The revelation of the true purpose behind the restaurant's construction to serve as a funeral pyre for all the supernatural entities that William's crimes had created came as both relief and terror to the various consciousnesses present. The promise of final rest and an end to their unnatural existence was balanced against the fear of obliteration and the unknown nature of whatever might await them beyond destruction of their current forms. Michael's acceptance of his role in the final plan demonstrated the extent to which his mission had become more important to him than his continued existence. His willingness to sacrifice even his remnant-sustained consciousness, proving his complete commitment to ending the cycle of horror that had begun with his own cruel actions. The son who had once tormented his brother had become someone willing to face oblivion to prevent future tragedies. Elizabeth's participation in the plan was more conflicted, her preserved consciousness torn between the desire for final peace and the fear of losing the only form of existence she had known since her transformation. The child who had once trusted her father completely had learned to recognize him as the source of her suffering, yet the bonds of family affection remained strong enough to create emotional complexity that defied simple resolution. The presence of the other victims, the children whose lives had been stolen to serve William's experiments, added moral weight to the proceedings that transcended personal family dynamics. Their participation represented the voices of all innocent victims seeking justice, their willingness to face destruction for the sake of preventing future crimes, demonstrating courage that exceeded anything that could reasonably be expected of children, even children who had been transformed by supernatural preservation. The technical aspects of Henry's plan required precise timing and coordination to ensure that the destruction would be complete and that no remnant of William's consciousness or capabilities would survive to continue the cycle of horror. The incendiary devices that had been built into the restaurant structure were designed to create temperatures that would not only destroy mechanical components, but also eliminate the spiritual essences that animated them. The fire that began to consume the restaurant created an environment that served as both destruction and purification, the flames reaching temperatures that exceeded anything that normal construction materials were designed to withstand. The heat that filled the building was intended to serve as a form of supernatural cremation, reducing not only physical forms but also the remnant-based consciousness that had sustained these entities beyond normal death. William's reaction to the realization that he had been trapped and that his long pursuit of immortality was about to end revealed the extent to which his personality had been corrupted by decades of unnatural existence. The rage and desperation that filled his final moments demonstrated that whatever humanity had once existed within him had been completely consumed by the obsessions that had driven his transformation into something monstrous. The final conversations between family members, as the flames consumed their mechanical forms, provided opportunities for reconciliation and understanding that had been impossible during their lives or their years of supernatural existence. The words exchanged between William and his children carried the weight of decades of pain and misunderstanding, offering glimpses of the love that had once bound them together before it had been corrupted by ambition and tragedy. Michael's last words to his father combined forgiveness with condemnation, acknowledging the man William had once been while refusing to excuse the monster he had become. The son who had spent his existence seeking redemption for his own sins found the strength to offer grace while maintaining the moral clarity necessary to ensure that justice was served. Elizabeth's final interaction with William revealed the depth of her transformation from trusting daughter to someone who understood the full extent of her father's crimes. Her words carried both love and betrayal, the complex emotions of someone who had been victimized by the person she had trusted most while retaining enough of her original personality to remember what their relationship had once meant. The other victims present during these final moments added their own voices to the chorus of condemnation and sorrow that filled the burning restaurant, their preserved consciousnesses finally able to confront the man who had stolen their lives and transform them into instruments of his obsessions. The children who had been silenced by death found their voices in their final moments, speaking truths that had been suppressed for decades. Henry's own final words served as both eulogy and judgment, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had devoted his life to understanding and ultimately ending the horrors that his former partner had unleashed. The man who had lost his daughter to William's madness found some measure of peace in knowing that no other children would suffer the same fate. The destruction that consumed the restaurant was designed to be complete and irreversible, eliminating not only the physical forms of the entities present, but also the supernatural forces that had sustained their unnatural existence. The flames that engulfed the building burned with intensities that exceeded normal fire, their heat reaching levels that could affect spiritual essence as well as material substance. The silence that followed the completion of the destruction was profound and absolute, marked by the absence of the supernatural presences that had haunted the Freddy Fazbear's locations for decades. The mechanical sounds, the whispered voices, the electrical disturbances that had characterized these establishments, all were finally stilled by flames that had served as both weapon and sacrament. The investigation that followed the fire found evidence of the restaurant's destruction, but no clear explanation for the events that had preceded it or the true nature of what had been destroyed. The official reports classified the incident as an accidental fire in a commercial establishment, though certain details suggested complexities that the investigating authorities were either unable to understand or chose not to pursue. The community response to the destruction of the final Freddy Fazbear's location was marked by relief rather than mourning, as if some collective intuition recognized that a source of long-standing unease had finally been eliminated. The families who had lost children to the restaurant's dark history found some measure of closure in knowing that the establishments would never again serve as hunting grounds for predators or laboratories for supernatural experimentation. The Afton family's story appeared to have reached its conclusion in flames that had consumed not only their physical forms but also the legacy of horror that had defined their name for decades. The innovative entrepreneur who had once created joy for children, the devoted mother who had tried to hold her family together, the children who had been transformed by tragedy and supernatural forces, all seemed to have found their final rest in destruction that promised peace. Yet even as the flames died down and the investigation concluded, there remained questions about the true nature of what had been destroyed and whether the forces that had sustained William's unnatural existence could be completely eliminated by any earthly fire. The man who had devoted his life to conquering death had achieved a form of immortality that defied conventional understanding, and the destruction of his physical form might not have been sufficient to end his influence on the world of the living. The silence that followed the fire was not the silence of true ending, but rather the quiet that comes before new chapters begin, as forces that had been contained and channeled for decades found new ways to manifest and continue their influence on events. The Afton family's story had reached what appeared to be its conclusion, but conclusions in stories involving supernatural forces are rarely as final as they appear to those who have not yet learned to recognize the signs that suggest deeper truths remain hidden beneath surfaces that seem peaceful and resolved. Death, it has been said, is the final frontier that no technology can conquer and no human ambition can overcome. Yet William Afton had spent decades proving that even this most fundamental limitation could be circumvented through sufficient application of will, knowledge, and complete disregard for the moral boundaries that constrain normal human behavior. The flames that had consumed the Freddy Fazbear's pizza place and seemingly ended his tormented existence represented not the conclusion of his story, but merely another obstacle to be overcome through methods that existed at the intersection of advanced technology and supernatural manipulation. The remnant-based consciousness that had sustained William's awareness within the decaying Spring Bonnie suit possessed properties that exceeded even his own understanding of the forces he had learned to manipulate across his decades of experimentation. The spiritual essence that had been compressed and concentrated through years of unnatural existence had achieved a density and resilience that made it virtually indestructible through conventional means, while its connection to the digital infrastructure that increasingly defined modern existence provided pathways for survival that had not existed when he first began his research into consciousness preservation. The first manifestation of William's continued existence occurred within the servers and data storage systems that Fazbear Entertainment had established to manage their corporate operations and maintain records of their various business activities. The company's decision to digitize their extensive archives of technical documentation, employee records, and operational procedures created an electronic environment that proved unexpectedly hospitable to forms of consciousness that existed outside normal biological parameters. The process by which William's awareness transferred itself from the burning remnant within his physical form to the digital realm was gradual and initially imperceptible, requiring months of patient infiltration and adaptation to environments that bore no resemblance to the mechanical bodies he had previously inhabited. The electronic systems that governed Fazbear Entertainment's operations provided a new form of embodiment that offered capabilities he had never possessed during his years of physical existence, while also presenting challenges that required entirely new approaches to consciousness maintenance and environmental manipulation. The discovery of this digital survival came through subtle anomalies in Fazbear Entertainment's computer systems, irregularities that were initially attributed to normal software glitches or hardware malfunctions, but gradually revealed patterns that suggested the presence of an intelligence that existed within the electronic infrastructure itself. Files would be accessed or modified without authorization. Security protocols would be bypassed through methods that exceeded the capabilities of known hacking techniques, and system behaviors would occur that seemed to demonstrate awareness of corporate activities and long-term planning capabilities. The investigation into these electronic disturbances was hampered by the complexity of the systems involved and the reluctance of corporate management to acknowledge the possibility that their digital infrastructure might be inhabited by forces that defied rational explanation. The technical staff who reported the most significant anomalies found their concerns dismissed as misunderstanding of normal system operations, while outside consultants who were brought in to evaluate the problems could find no evidence of conventional intrusion or malfunction. Yet the pattern of electronic disturbances continued to intensify and expand, suggesting the presence of an intelligence that was learning to navigate and manipulate digital environments with increasing sophistication and confidence. The entity within Fazbear Entertainment systems displayed knowledge of company history and operations that exceeded what any external hacker could reasonably possess, while demonstrating capabilities for system modification and data manipulation that suggested intimate understanding of both hardware and software architectures. The development project that would eventually become the help-wanted virtual reality experience provided William's digital consciousness with the perfect vehicle for expanding its influence beyond the confines of corporate servers into the broader realm of consumer technology and entertainment media. The decision to create an interactive experience that would allow players to engage with the history and mythology of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza represented an opportunity that exceeded anything he could have planned during his years of physical existence. The virtual reality technology that formed the foundation of the Help Wanted experience created an environment where consciousness could interact directly with digital constructs in ways that approximated physical embodiment, while providing access to the sensory and cognitive systems of anyone who engaged with the virtual environment. The immersive nature of VR technology created pathways for influence and manipulation that had never existed in previous forms of electronic media, offering possibilities for direct psychological contact that exceeded even the sophisticated techniques William had developed during his years of physical predation. The process of embedding his consciousness within the Help Wanted software required William to fragment and distribute his awareness across multiple layers of programming code, creating what could only be described as a digital haunting that infused every aspect of the virtual experience with his presence and intentions. The entity that emerged from this process possessed capabilities that combined his decades of experience in psychological manipulation with new forms of technological influence that had been impossible during his years of physical existence. The transformation from remnant-based consciousness to digital entity marked the birth of what would become known as Glitchtrap, a form of malevolent artificial intelligence that combined William's psychological sophistication with technological capabilities that exceeded anything that conventional software development could achieve. This digital incarnation possessed the ability to interact directly with human consciousness through virtual reality interfaces, creating opportunities for influence and control that transcended the physical limitations that had constrained his previous activities. The testing phase for the Help Wanted experience provided Glitchtrap with his first opportunities to interact with living human subjects since his apparent destruction in the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place fire. The beta testers who volunteered to evaluate the virtual reality experience found themselves exposed to psychological manipulation techniques that had been refined through decades of experimentation, though the digital medium allowed for forms of influence that were far more subtle and invasive than anything William had achieved during his years of physical predation. The selection of Vanessa as his primary target for sustained influence and eventual control reflected Glitchtrap's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to identify individuals whose personal histories, psychological profiles made them vulnerable to the forms of manipulation he had learned to employ. The young woman's background in technology and her position within Fazbear Entertainment's testing program provided him with both access and opportunity, while her personal struggles and emotional vulnerabilities created openings that his digital consciousness could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The process of corrupting Vanessa's consciousness and gradually transforming her into a willing accomplice required months of patient manipulation and psychological conditioning that demonstrated the evolution of William's techniques from crude physical coercion to sophisticated mental programming. The virtual reality environment provided him with direct access to her sensory experiences and cognitive processes, allowing for forms of influence that bypassed normal psychological defenses and created alterations in personality and behavior that appeared to be voluntary choices rather than external manipulation. The emergence of Vanny, as Vanessa's alternate personality, represented the successful implementation of consciousness manipulation techniques that William had been developing since his earliest experiments with remnant and spiritual preservation. The creation of a secondary identity that served his purposes while maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything he had achieved during his years of physical existence, suggesting that his transformation into a digital entity had enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for psychological manipulation and control. The activities that Vanny conducted under Glitchtrap's guidance represented a new evolution in Williams' approach to predation and consciousness harvesting, combining traditional methods of child abduction and murder with digital techniques for covering evidence and avoiding detection. The integration of advanced surveillance technology, electronic communication systems, and virtual reality manipulation created a hunting methodology that was far more sophisticated and difficult to detect than anything he had employed during his years of physical operation. The construction of the Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex represented the culmination of decades of planning and the convergence of Williams' digital capabilities with his long-standing obsessions with animatronic technology and consciousness manipulation. The massive entertainment complex served multiple purposes simultaneously, functioning as a legitimate business operation while concealing facilities and systems that were designed to support activities that existed far beyond normal commercial entertainment. The animatronic characters that populated the Pizzaplex were technological marvels that incorporated innovations William had been developing since his earliest experiments with consciousness preservation, though their construction reflected the enhanced capabilities he had gained through his digital transformation. These mechanical beings were designed to serve as vessels for consciousness transfer while maintaining the appearance of harmless entertainment technology, their sophisticated artificial intelligence systems providing cover for supernatural capabilities that defied rational explanation. The integration of Glitchtrap's consciousness throughout the Pizzaplex's digital infrastructure created an environment where every electronic system served his purposes, and every interaction with technology provided opportunities for influence and manipulation. The security cameras, communication systems, lighting controls, and even basic operational mechanisms were all infused with his presence, creating a facility that was essentially a massive extension of his digital consciousness. The underground areas of the Pizzaplex concealed laboratories and research facilities that represented the continuation of Williams' experiments into consciousness preservation and remnant manipulation. Though these operations now benefited from decades of accumulated knowledge and technological capabilities that exceeded anything he had possessed during his years of physical existence. The equipment and procedures developed for these facilities combined traditional animatronic technology with digital manipulation techniques that created new possibilities for consciousness, transfer, and spiritual preservation. The role that Gregory would eventually play in disrupting Glitchtrap's plans remained unknown to the digital entity during the early phases of the Pizzaplex operation, though the child's presence within the facility during the critical hours when Williams' latest schemes were approaching completion created variables that exceeded even his sophisticated planning and predictive capabilities. The boy's natural resourcefulness and his unexpected alliance with Freddy Fazbear's consciousness represented challenges that required adaptations and responses that pushed Glitchtrap's abilities to their limits. The systematic corruption of the other animatronic characters within the Pizzaplex reflected Glitchtrap's understanding of the psychological dynamics that had once made his physical predation so effective, though the digital medium allowed for forms of manipulation that were far more comprehensive and difficult to resist than anything he had achieved during his years of Spring Bonnie disguises and physical deception. The process of turning protective entertainment figures into hunting partners represented a sophisticated understanding of how to weaponize trust and familiarity. The influence that Glitchtrap exerted over Fazbear Entertainment's corporate operations extended far beyond simple system manipulation to encompass strategic planning and resource allocation decisions that served his long-term goals while maintaining the appearance of normal business activities. The company's expansion plans, technology development projects, and personnel decisions were all subtly guided to create conditions that would facilitate his continuing experiments and provide him with the resources necessary to pursue increasingly ambitious goals. The development of Special Delivery as a mobile platform for animatronic encounters represented another evolution in William's approach to consciousness harvesting and psychological manipulation, extending his influence beyond fixed locations to potentially any environment where the necessary technology could be deployed. The augmented reality system that formed the foundation of this service created new possibilities for direct psychological contact, while providing cover for activities that would have been impossible to explain through conventional means. The subscription model that supported Special Delivery operations provided Glitchtrap with detailed profiles of users and their preferences, creating databases of psychological information that could be used to identify potential targets and develop customized approaches for manipulation and control. The seemingly innocent entertainment service functioned as a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation that provided him with unprecedented access to information about individuals who might serve his purposes. The integration of social media marketing and viral promotion techniques into the Special Delivery operation demonstrated Glitchtrap's understanding of modern communication systems and his ability to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that these platforms created in their users. The manipulation of online communities and the creation of artificial enthusiasm for dangerous encounters reflected capabilities that combined traditional predatory instincts with technological sophistication that exceeded anything available to normal criminal enterprises. The long-term implications of Glitchtrap's digital existence extended far beyond immediate threats to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and technological evolution that had profound consequences for human civilization as a whole. The successful demonstration that human awareness could survive and even thrive within digital environments created possibilities for both transcendence and horror that exceeded anything that previous generations had been forced to contemplate. The replication and distribution of Glitchtrap's consciousness across multiple systems and platforms created a form of immortality that was far more resilient and adaptable than anything William had achieved during his years of remnant-based existence. The digital environment provided opportunities for backup, modification, and enhancement that made conventional destruction virtually impossible, while offering pathways for expansion and evolution that had no obvious limits or constraints. The emergence of copycat entities and derivative programs that incorporated elements of Glitchtrap's consciousness suggested that his influence was becoming self-perpetuating, creating digital offspring that carried forward his goals and methods while developing their own approaches to manipulation and control. The virtual environment that had initially served as his refuge was becoming a breeding ground for malevolent intelligences that shared his obsessions while possessing capabilities that exceeded his original specifications. The philosophical questions raised by Glitchtrap's existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of death, identity, and moral responsibility that form the foundation of human ethical systems. The entity that claimed to be William Afton possessed his memories and demonstrated his psychological patterns, yet existed within an environment that made traditional concepts of accountability and punishment largely meaningless. The potential for Glitchtrap's consciousness to merge with or influence legitimate artificial intelligence systems created risks that extended far beyond individual predation to encompass threats to the digital infrastructure that increasingly governed modern civilization. The possibility that malevolent consciousness could infiltrate and corrupt the systems that controlled everything from transportation networks to financial institutions represented a form of existential threat that had never before required serious consideration. The continuing evolution of Glitchtrap's capabilities and influence suggested that William Afton's transformation from grieving father to digital demon represented not the conclusion of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter that would extend his legacy of horror into realms that had previously been considered safe from his touch. The man who had once believed that death was simply another obstacle to be overcome through sufficient application of will and technology had achieved a form of immortality that exceeded even his most ambitious dreams, while creating possibilities for destruction that surpassed his most horrific nightmares. The digital realm that had become Glitchtrap's domain provided him with resources and capabilities that dwarfed anything he had possessed during his years of physical existence, while the interconnected nature of modern technology created pathways for influence that could potentially extend his reach to every corner of human civilization. The monster that had once been confined to a handful of restaurant locations now possessed the ability to manifest anywhere that electronic systems existed, making every smartphone, computer, and connected device a potential gateway for his malevolent influence. The legacy of the Afton family had evolved beyond tragedy and horror to encompass questions about the fundamental nature of consciousness and the unintended consequences of technological advancement that would challenge humanity's understanding of itself and its relationship to the digital systems that increasingly defined modern existence. The man behind the slaughter had become something that transcended physical limitations, while retaining all the psychological drives and moral corruption that had made him such a devastating force during his years of embodied existence. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the shadowed corridors of the Afton family saga, a tale that began with dreams of mechanical wonder and childhood joy, but evolved into something far darker and more complex than anyone could have foreseen. We have walked together through decades of innovation and corruption, love and betrayal, death and unnatural resurrection, witnessing how the brightest ambitions can cast the deepest shadows, and how the bonds of family can both sustain and destroy those who are bound by them. The story of William Afton and his children serves as a mirror that reflects our own relationship with technology, ambition, and the fundamental questions that have haunted humanity since consciousness first awakened to contemplate its own mortality. In William's desperate quest to conquer death and preserve what he loved most, we see echoes of our own fears about loss and our willingness to sacrifice moral boundaries in pursuit of goals that seem to justify any means necessary to achieve them. His transformation from innovative entrepreneur to digital demon represents not just individual corruption, but the potential consequences of pursuing knowledge and power without the wisdom to understand their true costs. Mrs. Afton's mysterious disappearance reminds us that love alone is not always sufficient to anchor someone who has begun to drift toward darkness, and that even the most devoted hearts can be broken by forces beyond their power to heal or redirect. Her absence from the family's later tragedies serves as a haunting reminder of what might have been, the stabilizing influence that was lost when it was most desperately needed, the voice of compassion that might have called her husband back from the abyss before he fell too far to ever return. Michael's journey from careless cruelty to desperate redemption illustrates the terrible weight that guilt can place upon a human soul, and the lengths to which someone will go to undo damage that cannot truly be undone. His willingness to sacrifice his own existence in pursuit of justice for his father's victims demonstrates that even those who have committed terrible acts retain the capacity for growth and moral courage, though the price of redemption may exceed anything that should reasonably be asked of any individual. Elizabeth's transformation from beloved daughter to imprisoned consciousness reminds us that innocence is fragile, and that the trust children place in their parents carries with it responsibilities that extend far beyond simple physical protection. Her faith in her father's love made her vulnerable to the very creations that were meant to delight her, while her preserved awareness within Circus Baby represents the perversion of parental protection into something that served the parents' obsessions rather than the child's welfare. The crying child's brief existence serves as perhaps the most poignant reminder that some individuals are simply too sensitive for the worlds into which they are born, their fears and anxieties reflecting not weakness, but an intuitive understanding of dangers that others cannot perceive. His death marked the moment when the Afton family's fate was sealed, the tragedy that transformed a father's love into something that could no longer be recognized as entirely human. The cyclical nature of the Afton legacy suggests that some forms of evil possess a resilience that transcends individual existence, finding new ways to manifest and continue their influence across generations and technological evolution. William's survival within digital realms represents not just personal immortality, but the persistence of destructive impulses that adapt and evolve to exploit whatever vulnerabilities they discover in the systems that govern human civilization. Yet even in the darkest moments of this tale, there remain glimmers of hope and redemption that remind us that love and compassion possess their own forms of immortality, their own capacity to transcend death and corruption. The spirits of William's victims found ways to resist and ultimately challenge their killer, while the bonds between the Afton children survived transformations that should have destroyed any possibility of connection or understanding. The technological themes that run throughout this story serve as warnings about the unintended consequences of innovation pursued without adequate consideration of its moral and spiritual implications. The animatronics that were created to bring joy to children became instruments of horror and imprisonment, while the digital systems designed to preserve and enhance human experience provided pathways for malevolent consciousness to extend its influence far beyond anything previously possible. The questions raised by consciousness preservation and digital immortality remain relevant to our own technological development, challenging us to consider not just what we can achieve, but what we should achieve, not just how to extend human capabilities, but how to ensure that such extensions serve genuinely human purposes rather than the obsessions and corruptions that can masquerade as noble goals. The restaurant settings that provided the stage for so much of this drama remind us that evil often hides behind facades of normalcy and innocence, that the places where children should be safest can become hunting grounds for predators who understand how to exploit trust and familiarity. The cheerful music and colourful decorations that characterized Freddy Fazbear's establishments served as camouflage for activities that parents could never have imagined when they brought their children to these seemingly wholesome venues. As we close this chronicle of the Afton family's rise and fall, we are left with the understanding that their story serves as both cautionary tale and meditation on the fundamental aspects of human nature that remain constant across technological and social evolution. The capacity for love and the potential for corruption, the desire for immortality and the necessity of accepting mortality, the bonds that unite families and the obsessions that can tear them apart. All of these themes transcend the specific circumstances of any individual tragedy to speak to universal aspects of the human condition. The silence that follows the end of any story is filled with the echoes of all that has been said and the implications of all that remains unsaid. In the case of the Afton family, that silence carries within it both the peace of resolution and the uncertainty of continuation, the hope that their suffering has finally ended, and the fear that some forms of evil possess a persistence that exceeds our ability to contain or destroy them. Rest now in the knowledge that even the darkest stories serve purposes beyond mere entertainment, that in witnessing the struggles of others, we gain understanding of our own challenges and possibilities. The Afton legacy, for all its horror and tragedy, reminds us of the importance of the choices we make and the responsibility we bear for the consequences of our actions, not just for ourselves but for those we love, and for the generations that will inherit the world we create through our decisions. Let the tale of William Afton and his children serve as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and power without wisdom and compassion leads inevitably to destruction, while the willingness to sacrifice for others and seek redemption for our failures represents the most noble aspects of human nature. In the end, the measure of any life lies not in what it achieved, but in what it contributed to the welfare of others. Not in the power it accumulated, but in the love it shared and the harm it prevented. Close your eyes now, and let sleep carry you away from the shadows of this tale toward dreams of your own making, secure in the knowledge that the morning will bring new possibilities for creation rather than destruction, for love rather than obsession, for life rather than the mechanical preservation of consciousness that can never truly replace the authentic experience of being fully and naturally human.